How did such a breakable creature come to stand above forests, coastlines, herds, and empires, as if the earth had always been waiting for human hands to name it? The deeper one looks into the oldest layers of the story, the stranger that rise begins to feel, because the trail is not clear but broken, scattered, and dimly lit by bones, ash, and silence. So before the body sinks fully into this quiet, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this is truly the kind of work you enjoy here. And perhaps before the night grows deeper, share your location and local time, so this wandering story may know where it has found you. The story of man becoming the ruler of the earth is usually told as though it were obvious from the beginning, as though the ending had always been hidden inside the first upright step. But nothing in the oldest evidence suggests certainty. Nothing in those long erased ages announces a chosen species. The earth was never empty, never waiting politely for one creature to inherit it. It was crowded, dangerous, ancient, far beyond memory, alive with teeth, weather, disease, darkness, and the immense indifference of changing climates. In that world, the human line did not appear as a sovereign. It appeared as one more experiment among many. That may be the first discomfort buried beneath the familiar story. If one were to stand in Africa millions of years ago and watch those early hominins moving along woodland edges and broken grasslands, there would have been no reason to assume that this uncertain branch would one day redraw rivers, level mountains, count the stars, and decide which species should continue breathing. They were not the fastest animals in the open. They were not the strongest bodies in the forest. They had no claws, no thick hide, no venom, no great fangs flashing at the edge of the light. Their children took years to mature. Their survival depended on fragile cooperation. They were, in nearly every visible sense, exposed. And yet exposed things sometimes endure in strange ways. The fossil record gives glimpses, never a full confession. Sahelanthropus, Ardipithecus, Australopithecus, names given much later to fragments of beings who never imagined they would be studied. A skull here, a pelvis there. Footprints pressed into ancient ash and then sealed by luck. The famous skeleton called Lucy, delicate and incomplete, discovered in Ethiopia in 1974, did not arrive like an answer. She arrived like a whisper from a corridor whose walls had mostly fallen away. Her small frame suggested a creature balanced between worlds, not fully of the trees, not fully of the open plain, carrying in her bones not a triumph, but a transition. That is what makes the beginning so haunting. Humanity does not emerge from the record like a monument rising cleanly from the ground. It flickers, it stutters, it vanishes and returns under different names. Species appear, overlap and dissolve. Branches separate, perhaps meet again, then disappear into earth that keeps more secrets than it releases. Even now, arguments persist over where one form ends and another begins, whether certain bones belong to separate species or simply to variation within a wider family. The origin story is not a straight line. It is a field of broken threads. Some scholars point to climate instability in Africa as one of the hidden forces that shaped this uncertainty. Forests contracted and expanded, wetlands shifted, grasslands spread, then retreated, lakes formed and vanished. A world like that does not reward perfection. It rewards flexibility, endurance, and the uneasy ability to improvise. Perhaps that is one of the earliest keys. Man did not rise in a stable paradise designed for smooth advancement. Man was carved by fluctuation. The world changed too often for comfort, and so the creatures that survived were often the ones able to live with incompleteness. Still, survival is not rulership. That distinction matters. To survive is merely to remain. To rule is to impose shape, to dominate conditions, to reorganize the fates of others. Somewhere between those two states, something irreversible happened. But in the deep beginning, one finds only vulnerability. Early stone tools, associated with some of these ancient ancestors, do not feel like the instruments of masters. They feel like admissions of weakness. A sharpened edge is what a soft-bodied creature makes when its own body is not enough. Tool-making in this sense may have begun not with confidence, but with lack. There is a quiet dignity in that, and perhaps a warning too. The human ascent may not have begun because the species was superior in any complete or simple way. It may have begun because it was insufficient, and insufficiency forced invention. Fire had not yet transformed the night into something negotiable. Language, at least in its later richness, had not yet bound large groups into imagined orders. Agriculture, kingship, scripture, empire, all of that still lay so far ahead that it would have seemed impossible. At first there was only the long apprenticeship of exposure, hunger, heat, cold, predators, childbirth, injury, loss. A creature learning the shape of danger by living close to it. And all around that fragile learning the evidence keeps falling silent. Entire populations may have existed without leaving remains that survived. Coastlines where early people may have wandered now lie drowned beneath later seas. Forest soils swallowed bones before they could harden into memory. The few things that remain are often those that accident preserved, not those that mattered most. This creates a troubling possibility. What if the true beginning of human ascendancy is not merely unknown, but structurally hidden? What if the decisive thresholds were passed in places the earth did not keep? There are other shadows too. The old story used to imagine evolution as a ladder, a neat procession climbing upward toward modern man. But the more the record expanded, the less that image could survive. Evolution now looks more like a thicket, many forms, many experiments, many extinctions. The ruler of the earth, in that light, begins to look less like the intended result and more like the last surviving claimant after countless forgotten trials. That does not diminish humanity. It unsettles it. It suggests that history might not be the unfolding of destiny, but the residue of contingency. A few million years can erase almost any certainty. Volcanic ash can preserve a footprint for ages, yet whole communities vanish without a trace. A jawbone can rewrite a timeline. A tooth can unsettle a textbook. Every few decades, some new discovery shifts the picture again. Older tools than expected, migration patterns revised, ancient environments reconsidered. Each revelation illuminates something, but also widens the darkness around it. The more one learns, the more the rise of man begins to resemble not a solved narrative, but an archive that has been burned and reconstructed from glowing fragments. Perhaps that is why the opening of this story must begin not with conquest, but with missingness. Before man ruled the earth was already ruling the terms of the story, deciding what would remain and what would be lost. Bones broke, sediments buried, waters moved, memory thinned. And out of that thinning, later ages would build confident stories about progress, superiority, and rightful inheritance. But confidence is often easiest where records are weakest. A broken archive invites grand certainty from those who arrive too late. So the first image worth keeping is not a crown, nor a city, nor a victorious hunter standing above the world. It is something quieter, a small group moving through a landscape that does not notice them. Wind crossing tall grass, distant animal calls in the dark, a body not yet secure in its future, hands already capable of grasping but not yet of claiming dominion, eyes watching the horizon, not as rulers, but as creatures who understand how quickly life can disappear. And perhaps that is the most unsettling beginning of all. If the species that would one day rename the planet began as something so uncertain, so incomplete, so nearly lost among many other living possibilities, then what exactly elevated it? Was it intelligence alone, or hardship, cooperation, or fear? Adaptation, or some deeper rupture in the order of life that erased stronger rivals and left this vulnerable line standing? The bones do not answer quickly. They remain where they were found, half-lit, patient, withholding. and in their silence there is already the outline of a larger suspicion, that before man learned how to rule the earth, he may first have learned how to survive a world that kept removing its own evidence. If the earliest chapter of human ascent is obscured by missing bones and broken timelines, the next disturbance is even harder to ignore. The earth was not handed from beast to man in a single, elegant transfer. For a long stretch of prehistory, this planet did not belong to one humanity, but to several. The old image of a lone species slowly perfecting itself in isolation has faded under the pressure of newer discoveries. What has emerged in its place is stranger, less comfortable, and more difficult to simplify. Homo sapiens was not alone. It walked beside others who were also human, also intelligent, also adapted to harsh worlds, and now almost entirely gone. That disappearance hangs over the story like a question no one has fully answered. Neanderthals in Western Eurasia, Denisovans in parts of Asia, known first from almost impossibly little, a finger bone, a few teeth, fragments that seem too small to carry such consequences. Homo floresiensis on an Indonesian island, tiny and astonishing, as if an older chapter had survived in miniature. Homo naledi in South Africa, enigmatic and debated. Other hints, other remains, other branches that refuse to sit neatly inside the categories built for them. The deeper the record expands, the less modern humanity looks like the inevitable summit of a simple progression. It begins to resemble the last visible branch in a grove that once held many living forms. That changes the emotional centre of the story. The rise of man is no longer just the tale of how one species learned to master the world. It also becomes the story of how other kinds of humans vanished while one remained. That is not a small distinction. It turns triumph into aftermath. There was a time when the valleys, forests, caves, and open plains of Eurasia may have known more than one human voice, different bodies shaped by different climates, different faces meeting the same winter light, different ways of hunting, grieving, shaping stone, tending fire, perhaps even telling stories whose echoes were never written down. Neanderthals were once imagined as crude and dim, as useful foils for modern superiority, but that image has worn away under evidence they did not deserve such dismissal. They buried some of their dead. They made tools of striking sophistication. They survived glacial environments that would have crushed less resilient beings. They were powerful, capable, and deeply adapted to the worlds they inhabited. And still they disappeared. One might say that extinction is normal. Most branches of life end. Most experiments fail. But that explanation, though true in a cold geological sense, does not quiet the unease here. These were not distant reptiles or giant insects separated from modern humanity by incomprehensible ages. These were near relatives. In some cases, they were more than relatives. Genetics has revealed what older stories did not expect. Modern humans and Neanderthals interbred. Denisovans too left traces in living populations, especially in parts of Asia and Oceania. The old boundary between us and them has blurred. Their extinction did not leave us untouched. It entered us. That fact alone reshapes the silence. The vanished were not entirely erased, only dissolved into the bodies of the survivors. A person living now may carry fragments of those lost worlds in their cells, inherited from meetings that took place tens of thousands of years ago, under skies no map remembers. It is a strange thought. The ruler of the earth may not be a pure inheritor of one triumphant line, but a composite being, partly built from encounters with other humans who did not survive as separate peoples. Yet mixture does not explain disappearance. It only softens the border around it. The central mystery remains. Why did Homo sapiens spread so widely while other human species contracted and vanished? Scholars have proposed many forces: climate volatility, smaller population sizes, competition for prey, disease, differences in social networks, different reproductive patterns, different responses to stress. Some suggest that Homo sapiens held an advantage in cooperation across wider distances, maintaining more flexible alliances and exchange systems. Others point to symbolic culture, longer trade networks, or a capacity for rapid adaptation when environments shifted. None of these proposals is absurd, none closes the case, because there is something elusive in the pattern. Neanderthals had survived Europe and Western Asia through cycles of cold and instability long before Homo sapiens entered those lands. They were not fragile mistakes awaiting replacement. They were seasoned inhabitants of difficult environments. If they faded after our species arrived, one cannot help wondering whether the change was ecological, cultural, demographic, or something harsher. Not necessarily a single war, not some dramatic final confrontation preserved in legend, but a long attrition of overlapping pressures. Competition does not always need a battlefield. Sometimes it is quieter. A hunting range narrows, a mating network shrinks, a climate pulse strikes at the wrong moment. A few bad generations arrive in sequence. A people thins without spectacle. This possibility is more unsettling than a clean story of conquest. It suggests that the rise of Homo sapiens may have depended less on heroic superiority than on a kind of historical weather, in which many small advantages accumulated while other branches were pushed, season after season, towards silence. If so, human dominion began not with one glorious breakthrough, but with the gradual removal of rivals who were close enough to resemble us and distant enough to disappear. And that resemblance matters. It raises a moral shadow over prehistory, even if morality cannot be easily applied to beings living under Ice Age conditions. What does it mean that the only surviving human species is the one that now tells the story? What distortions enter a narrative when all alternative witnesses are gone? Every history written by winners is incomplete. A prehistory inherited from the only remaining branch may be incomplete in an even deeper sense. It contains no testimony from the lost. There is an eerie symbolism in the way Denisovans first emerged into scientific awareness, not through a grand city or a complete skeleton, but through a small bone fragment from a Siberian cave, carrying in its chemistry the trace of a people previously unknown, an entire human group hidden in plain geological time, invisible until laboratory methods became refined enough to notice them. How many more absences remain? How many chapters were lived fully and then folded into stone so efficiently that only new techniques can detect them? The archive of human origins does not simply have holes. It may contain entire populations still waiting to be recognized. That thought presses gently against the myth of human certainty. Man did not rise across an empty stage. He emerged in a crowded family drama whose cast has mostly been erased. To call him ruler of the earth without acknowledging those vanished companions is to mistake survival for singularity. It is to turn a thicket into a line, a graveyard into a coronation. And still the question deepens. If other humans once shared the planet, if they hunted, endured, adapted, loved, feared, and perhaps imagined the world in ways now unrecoverable, then what exactly was lost when they disappeared? Their bodies are one loss, their tools another. But perhaps the greatest loss lies elsewhere. Different minds may not only solve problems differently, they may inhabit reality differently. A vanished human species could carry a vanished way of being conscious in the world. If that is true, then the ascent of Homo sapiens was not merely the rise of one form, it was also the narrowing of what humanity could have been. The earth, meanwhile, kept no ceremony for that narrowing. Caves remained cold, rivers kept moving, snow fell over abandoned hunting grounds. The last Neanderthal child, whoever that was, left no written farewell. The last Denisovan campfire faded without inscription. Their worlds ended in silence so complete that modern people had to recover even their existence from scattered fragments. And perhaps that is the next threshold this story must cross. Before man became ruler of the earth, he may first have become the last man left to tell the story. If humanity survived the vanished company of other humans and continued walking through a world that had already forgotten so many of its own witnesses, then another question begins to glow at the edge of that darkness. What was the first force early people truly learned to command, not in imagination, not in myth, but in the trembling physical world before them? Long before walls, kings, ploughs, ships, and scripture, there was one element that altered the shape of fear itself. It gave light without sunrise, warmth without season, protection without claws. Yet even this turning point does not arrive cleanly in the record. Fire, like memory, flickers. It leaves traces, but rarely a full explanation. There is something almost ceremonial in the way evidence of controlled fire appears in deep time. Burned bones, heat-altered stone, ash concentrations, hearth-like features whose interpretation is often debated because nature too can burn, and not every blackened surface is a human statement. Some archaeological sites suggest the use of fire hundreds of thousands of years ago, perhaps even earlier, but certainty is difficult. Wonderwer Cave in South Africa has often entered this conversation, with evidence interpreted by some researchers as pointing to controlled fire nearly 1 million years ago. Other sites across Africa, the Levant and Eurasia offer hints, patterns, possibilities. Yet the deeper one goes, the more the story resists neat closure. Fire was surely transformative. But when exactly it ceased to be an accident and became a companion remains a question surrounded by ash. That uncertainty matters because it preserves the strangeness of the moment. One can imagine lightning striking dry grass, or a wildfire racing across a landscape, leaving behind heat, destruction, and the strange hypnotic pull of flame. Many animals fear fire. Early humans likely feared it too. But at some point, fear changed into attention. Attention changed into imitation. Imitation changed into custody. This may have been one of the most important shifts in the entire human story, not the invention of something new, but the decision to keep something dangerous close. What kind of mind does that require? Not merely intelligence in the abstract, but patience, memory, timing, and collective discipline. Fire must be fed. It must be watched. It must be carried or reignited. It punishes carelessness. It rewards vigilance. A group that keeps a fire does more than stay warm. It learns rhythm. Someone gathers fuel. Someone guards embers. Someone understands which wood burns slowly and which flares too quickly. A shared centre appears. Not yet a city, not yet an altar, but something around which bodies begin to organise themselves. That may be why fire feels larger than a tool. A sharpened stone extends the hand, but fire rearranges the environment. It pushes back darkness and cold. It alters food chemically, making something softer, safer, more digestible. Theories about cooking and human evolution have suggested that access to cooked food may have changed the body itself, reducing the energy needed for digestion, and perhaps contributing over long spans to changes in anatomy and social life. Such ideas remain debated in detail, as many things in prehistory must remain, but the broader intuition is difficult to dismiss. Fire did not merely assist early humans, it changed the terms under which they lived. Night, especially, would never have felt the same again. Before controlled flame, darkness was not a mood, but a boundary. Vision contracted. Predators moved differently. Sounds became larger than the bodies producing them. The sun governed activity with quiet authority. But a hearth bends that order. It lengthens wakefulness. It creates an island inside the dark. Around it, gestures can continue after sunset. Faces remain visible. Food can be shared. Injuries can be tended. Stories, if they were already beginning to form in the richer ways, can be told in a circle rather than in passing daylight. Fire does not only protect the body, it extends the social mind. This may have been the first invisible empire humans built. Not an empire of territory, but of altered conditions. Wherever fire travelled, a small pocket of the natural world had been renegotiated. Cold no longer spoke with final authority. Darkness no longer closed every conversation. Certain plants and meats no longer arrived only in the form given by nature. Heat could transform them. Smoke could preserve them. Flame could harden wooden tools, clear spaces, drive animals, reshape stone, and perhaps over long ages influence movement across colder regions once less habitable. The species that once appeared exposed now possessed a means of remaking its immediate surroundings, however modestly, each time the hearth was lit. And yet there is still an unease beneath the triumph. Fire gives, but it also teaches domination. To master flame is to become familiar with controlled destruction. Forest patches can be burned. Landscapes can be managed. Other creatures can be displaced. Some scholars have explored the role of anthropogenic fire in altering ecosystems, even in very early contexts. The full scale and chronology of such effects remain contested, but the principle is ancient enough to unsettle the imagination. The first command over nature may have begun with an act that both protected life and consumed it. That doubleness follows humanity forward. Fire gathers and destroys. It warms infants and burns settlements. It cooks food and hardens spear points, but it also prepares the long path toward furnaces, metallurgy, engines, explosives, and cities glowing through the night while forests vanish beyond them. In this sense, the earliest hearth already contains a distant prophecy. The ruler of the earth will be the creature that learns not only to use nature, but to accelerate it, redirect it, and risk being transformed by the forces it unleashes. Still, in those early ages, the atmosphere around fire may have been more intimate than grand. One can imagine small groups sitting close to embers while wind moved beyond the circle of light, sparks rising into a sky dense with stars, meat cooking slowly, shadows shifting across stone walls. Perhaps this was where observation deepened. Perhaps this was where the face became more central, where expressions mattered longer into the evening, where memory began to settle into patterns carried by repeated telling. No written record survives from those nights. Nothing can confirm what words were spoken, if words in the later sense were already there. But the emotional architecture seems hard to ignore. Fire created pause. Pause created attention. Attention may have thickened into meaning. There is also the possibility that controlled fire marked a new relation to time. Embers preserve yesterday inside tomorrow. A flame tonight may come from a flame kept alive the night before. Continuity becomes tangible. It glows in ash. That is no small thing for a species whose early existence was shaped by instability and rupture. To maintain fire is to resist disappearance in a visible form. Something has been carried through the dark and made to live again. That image, simple as it seems, touches something deeper in the human pattern. Again and again, the species survives by preserving a fragile continuity through hostile conditions. Memory, culture, law, ritual, knowledge, all later forms may in some distant sense resemble the ember before they resemble the monument. Perhaps this is why so many later civilizations wrapped fire in sacred language. It was never just matter. It stood too close to transformation. It consumed and renewed, illuminated and threatened, purified and annihilated. Even if early humans did not frame it in theology, the emotional power must have been profound. To sit before flame is to watch matter vanish into light and heat. It is to witness change happening visibly. For a mind beginning to seek pattern in the world, such a phenomenon could hardly remain neutral for long. And so the story of human rule moves 1 degree further from simple survival. The vulnerable creature did not merely endure the world and outlast rival branches of humanity. It learned to keep a piece of danger alive beside itself. That lesson may have altered everything. But even now, the firelit circle does not explain the whole ascent. Warmth and protection are not yet dominion. Light in the darkness is not yet mastery of the earth. It is only the beginning of a deeper change. The slow discovery that nature's powers could be borrowed, disciplined, and folded into human life. Once that possibility existed, perhaps the world itself began to look different. Not as an order to submit to, but as a field of forces waiting, however reluctantly, to be persuaded. And once a species begins to think that way, what else might it learn to command besides the night? Once a species has learned to sit beside fire and keep the darkness from closing completely, another mystery begins to gather around that circle of light. Warmth can protect the body. Cooked food can strengthen it. A watchful group can endure a longer night. But none of those things alone explains how one fragile kind of human eventually stretched itself across deserts, mountains, islands, forests, and frozen plains, carrying with it not only tools but systems, obligations, myths, and plans. Something less visible than fire and perhaps more dangerous had to emerge. The hand could shape stone. The flame could alter matter. But what first altered other minds? This is where the story becomes harder to hold, because language leaves no fossil in the ordinary sense. Bone preserves shape, ash preserves heat, footprints preserve movement. But a sentence vanishes the moment it is spoken, unless another mind receives it and carries it forward. The oldest words are gone more completely than the oldest skeletons. Whatever early humans first said to one another beside embers, on hunts, during childbirth, in grief, in warning, in affection, has been erased with almost perfect efficiency, and yet their disappearance proves nothing about their importance. If anything, it makes language feel even more foundational, because it may have shaped human destiny while leaving behind almost no direct trace. This creates one of the deepest paradoxes in the entire human ascent. The force that may have done most to elevate the species above its limits is also one of the hardest to recover. Scholars debate when fully modern language emerged, how gradual that development was, and whether symbolic behaviour appeared in waves, fits, or thresholds that differed from place to place. Some point to anatomical changes associated with speech. Others focus on brain organisation, social complexity, or the archaeological signs of symbolism, pigments, perforated shells, engraved ochre, ornaments, carefully arranged burials, patterns that seem to exceed immediate survival. None of these things is language itself. They are only its shadows. But shadows are sometimes enough to sense the outline of something immense. A species does not become the ruler of the earth merely by reacting faster or striking harder. It must coordinate beyond instinct. It must warn the absent, not just the present. It must refer to what is not here, the river beyond the hill, the herd seen yesterday, the person who betrayed trust, the season that is coming, the ancestor remembered, the danger not yet visible. At some point, human communication ceased to be limited to immediate signals and became a way of moving invisible things from one mind into another. That change, whenever it ripened, may have been as consequential as the control of fire. Because language does something, fire does not. Fire changes the environment outside the body. Language changes the environment inside a group. It allows cooperation to extend beyond sight and beyond the moment. A hunting plan can be shared before the hunt begins. A memory can outlive the one who first witnessed it. A warning can travel farther than the event that produced it. A promise can bind behaviour in the future. A lie can distort it. A name can stabilise identity. A story can turn scattered people into a people. In this sense, the first great territory humans conquered may not have been land at all. It may have been shared imagination. That possibility carries a faint unease. Shared imagination sounds gentle, even poetic, but it has enormous power. Once a group can believe in something it cannot touch, a rule, an ancestor, a taboo, a destiny, a boundary, a sacred place, it gains forms of cohesion that claws and muscle cannot easily overcome. A pack can hunt together. Many animals do that. But a human group can organise itself around absences, around remembered agreements, around meanings invisible to the eye. It can obey the dead. It can fear the unseen. It can cooperate with strangers because both parties trust the same story. This may have been the turning point where intelligence became social force. Archaeology offers strange and partial glimpses of this transformation. Ochre use in Africa stretches deep into prehistory, and while pigment alone proves little, it hints at a developing sensitivity to marking, display, perhaps even symbolism. Perforated shells and beads discovered at sites in North Africa and the Levant suggest adornment, signalling identity or ritual significance. Later, cave art in places like Chauvet, Lascaux, and elsewhere in Europe appears with such confidence and sophistication that it feels less like the birth of symbolic thought than the evidence of a tradition already mature. By the time these images enter the archaeological record, the inner world that produced them was surely not new, and those images are peculiar in ways that resist easy explanation. Animals move across cave walls with an intensity that feels ceremonial, observant, almost otherworldly. Hands appear as negatives, ghostly signatures, or warnings. Abstract signs accompany creatures whose presence in darkness seems to blur the line between representation and invocation. Scholars have debated whether such art relates to hunting magic, trance states, myth, teaching, territorial marking, or layered combinations of these and other functions. The interpretations vary because the artist left no glossary, yet perhaps that is precisely the point. The caves remind later ages that humans were filling the world with meaning long before they filled it with monuments. Burial practices deepen that suggestion. The careful placement of bodies, the use of ochre, grave goods in some later contexts, the repeated attention to the dead, all of these imply minds grappling with continuity, memory, and the possibility that a person might remain significant even after the body has stopped. This is not simply emotion. Many animals mourn in ways humans once refused to acknowledge. What seems distinctive here is structure, ritualized handling, symbolic attention, practices that make death part of a social system rather than a purely biological event. A species that can ritualize death is already extending its order beyond the living moment. It is tempting to call this a cognitive revolution, as some popular histories have done, but the phrase can sound cleaner than the record allows. Human mental life likely did not transform in one sudden universal explosion. More likely, it deepened unevenly across different populations, environments, and timescales, until eventually the cumulative effect became undeniable. Still, whether gradual or episodic, something changed. Humans became increasingly capable of inhabiting realities layered atop the physical world. A cave was no longer just shelter. A body was no longer just meat and bone. Fire was no longer just heat. A landscape could become ancestral. A sound could become a name. A gesture could become law. And law, even in its earliest unrecorded forms, is not merely a rule. It is a fiction with consequences. It does not exist as a rock exists. It exists because enough minds carry it, repeat it, enforce it, fear it, or honour it. The same may be said for kinship categories, marriage restrictions, ritual obligations, clan identity, and any number of early social patterns that would have shaped survival. This is where the human ascent begins to look almost uncanny. The species may have become powerful not because it escaped fiction, but because it learned to live inside it more completely than any rival. If that sounds too abstract, one need only imagine what such a capacity means in practical terms. 100 individuals can share food because of remembered obligation. Distant groups can exchange materials because symbolic ties reduce suspicion. Elders can teach not only technique but cosmology. Children can inherit not only genes but worlds. The past becomes portable. The future becomes discussable. The absent become influential. Invisible things start governing visible behaviour, and once that threshold is crossed, the planet changes in ways that are still difficult to measure. Human beings no longer move through the Earth as only biological organisms shaped by immediate conditions. They move as carriers of narratives, categories, and symbols, They begin imposing interpretive order on stone, animals, sky, death, and territory. That imposition is not yet empire, but the seed of empire is already there. To name is to begin to possess. To define is to begin to control. To persuade many minds to accept the same invisible map is to create a force stronger than any individual body. So the ascent continues, though not yet toward certainty. The filet circle now contains voices, signs, obligations remembered dead, and images cast against stone. A species once exposed and breakable has learned not only to endure the world, but to duplicate inner experience across many minds. That may have been the more decisive conquest. Yet even this new power leaves another question waiting beyond the edge of the light. If humans became strong by sharing meanings, then what would happen when shifting climates, moving herds, and widening landscapes forced those meanings to travel farther than ever before? Once meanings could travel from one mind to another, they no longer needed to remain where they were first spoken. A warning could move with a hunting band. A memory of water could pass across generations. A story about a valley, a dangerous pass, a season of scarcity, or a place where animals gathered could outlast the people who first discovered it. This may have been fortunate because the world that shaped early humanity was never still for very long. Climate kept rearranging the terms of survival. Forests advanced and retreated. Grasslands opened and narrowed. Rain shifted its loyalties. Cold deepened, loosened, then returned again. The earth itself seemed unwilling to provide one permanent stage on which human life could settle into ease. It is difficult to understand human ascendancy without taking seriously the cruelty and instability of the Ice Age world. The phrase itself can mislead, as though it refers to one uniform season of frozen silence. In truth, the Pleistocene was a long and complicated drama of climatic oscillation, with colder phases, warmer intervals, expanding ice sheets, changing coastlines, and ecological mosaics that could transform over spans short enough to matter to human communities. In such a world, no single adaptation was enough forever. What worked in one generation could fail in the next. Paths once open could close, rivers could shift, familiar prey could thin or move elsewhere. To live under those conditions was not simply to survive hardship, it was to become intimate with uncertainty. Perhaps that intimacy was one of humanity's most decisive teachers. A stable species in a stable niche can become exquisitely suited to a narrow way of life. But a world that keeps changing may favour something less elegant and more durable: flexibility, improvisation, and the ability to carry knowledge across broken conditions. If this is so, then the long age of climatic instability did not merely threaten human survival. It trained the species into a particular kind of resilience. Man did not become powerful in spite of disorder. He may have become powerful through prolonged exposure to it. This thought complicates the usual longing for lost golden ages. There may have been no easy beginning from which humans tragically fell. The deep past was often harsh beyond sentiment. Wind moved across open steppes under vast skies. Winters sharpened hunger. Drought could turn memory into a form of mourning. Small bands endured without certainty that a known world would remain recognizable for their children. Under such pressure, social bonds had to do more than comfort. They had to function as living infrastructure. Shared knowledge, stored in language, ritual, habit, and practical skill, became a form of shelter no less important than skin clothing or fire. Archaeology captures only fragments of this adaptation, but the fragments are enough to suggest something extraordinary. Tools became more varied, more specialized, better suited to different tasks and environments. Hunting strategies adjusted to the behavior of large animals and shifting terrain. The use of pigments, ornaments, and symbolic objects persisted even in demanding conditions, suggesting that psychological and social cohesion remained essential, not optional luxuries to be abandoned in hard times. A species facing repeated environmental stress did not retreat into pure instinct. It carried meaning with it. That may be one reason human endurance became so unusual. Other creatures were magnificently adapted to particular ecological roles, but humans increasingly behaved like beings who could improvise new roles when old ones collapsed. They did not possess the speed of the great predators, or the brute certainty of animals fully shaped for one niche. Instead, they possessed a kind of distributed intelligence, spread across individuals and reinforced by cooperation. A single human body remained vulnerable. A human group, linked by shared information and flexible behavior, could become something more difficult for catastrophe to erase, and catastrophe came often enough. During colder periods, vast ice sheets advanced across northern latitudes, transforming winds, rainfall patterns, vegetation, and animal movements far beyond the ice itself. Sea levels dropped, exposing land that is now drowned. Habitats rearranged themselves on continental scales. In warmer interludes, those conditions shifted again. It is likely that many human populations expanded, fragmented, reconnected, or vanished in response. Genetics hints at bottlenecks and dispersals, though their timing and interpretation remain subjects of research and debate. The deeper pattern, however, is unmistakable. Human history before history was not a calm ascent. It was a repeated negotiation with instability. This makes the later language of mastery feel strangely premature. To call man the ruler of the earth is to risk imagining dominion where there was first only endurance at the edge of loss. The Ice Age did not bow before humanity. It pressed against every weakness the species had. It shortened margins. It punished rigidity. It erased evidence. And yet that same pressure may have selected for traits that later made unprecedented expansion possible. The species that would one day build cities may first have learned its hardest lessons in landscapes where nothing resembling a city could survive. There is also a more troubling thought buried here. Hardship does not merely refine skill, it can alter values. A world of repeated disruption may reward caution toward outsiders, fierce defense of resources, rapid movement when conditions fail, and a sober familiarity with death. It may also produce creativity, because necessity strips away the illusion that old answers will always work. Human adaptability, admired in hindsight, may have been born in long episodes of fear. Innovation does not always emerge from comfort. Sometimes it emerges because comfort has been removed for generations. If so, then the human relationship with collapse may be older than civilization itself. Later societies would imagine catastrophe as an interruption of order, a fall from stability into chaos. But for early humans, instability may have been the baseline condition. Collapse, in a certain sense, came first. There were no permanent structures to lose on a monumental scale, but there were repeated losses nonetheless. Territories abandoned, routes forgotten, prey diminished, kin groups separated, entire lifeways made untenable by shifting climates. From this perspective, humanity's greatest talent may have been not preventing rupture, but continuing after it. This lends a deeper resonance to the idea of migration. Movement was not always heroic exploration or restless ambition. Often it may have been reluctant adjustment, the quiet recognition that the known world could no longer sustain life in the old way. A valley dries, a game route fails, winter extends further than expected, the group moves, children grow up elsewhere. A remembered landscape becomes a story rather than a home. Over generations, such displacements accumulate. Mobility becomes more than reaction, it becomes identity. And perhaps this is the hidden bridge between symbolic thought and planetary expansion. Once people could carry detailed knowledge, remembered roots, social obligations, and shared meanings through unstable conditions, movement ceased to be pure dispersal and became continuity in motion. The group did not simply wander. It transported a world within itself. Fire, language, memory, ritual, practical skill, kinship, warning, and grief all moved together. The body crossed distance, but so did the invisible architecture of human life. This may be why the Ice Age world, for all its severity, was not merely an enemy of human development. It was also a testing ground in which portable culture became a survival tool. The species that emerged from that long encounter was still biologically fragile, still exposed to predation, disease, injury, and starvation. But it had become increasingly difficult to isolate from its own accumulated knowledge. Human beings were no longer just animals in environments. They were carriers of environments remembered, compared, and reimagined. Such a species could eventually travel far. It could survive transitions that might destroy more specialized beings. It could enter new landscapes without being wholly remade by each one. That did not mean safety. It meant possibility. Yet possibility can be dangerous in its own way. A creature shaped by instability may learn not only how to endure the changing earth, but how to keep moving across it, adapting faster than many worlds can absorb. And once that motion begins to widen beyond familiar ranges, another mystery emerges from beneath the old shorelines and across the forgotten corridors of the planet. If climate taught man how to live after collapse, what happened when that lesson met the open road of continents waiting beyond the horizon? Once mobility became more than desperation and turned into a way of carrying continuity through unstable worlds, the Earth itself began to change scale. Distances that had once seemed final slowly became negotiable. Mountain corridors, river valleys, coastal plains, dry grasslands and seasonal passages turned into threads along which human life could extend itself. Yet the story of this expansion remains strangely incomplete, because many of the first roads no longer exist in any visible form. They lie beneath modern seas, beneath silt, beneath cities, beneath forests that rose long after the footsteps had passed. The movement that helped make man ruler of the earth may have unfolded along pathways the earth later erased. This is one of the quiet tragedies of prehistory. The earliest migrations were likely among the most decisive events in human existence, but much of their evidence was catastrophically vulnerable to rising water. During colder periods of the Pleistocene, sea levels were far lower than they are today. Vast coastal shelves lay exposed, shorelines extended far beyond their present edges, estuaries, lagoons, beaches, and marine-rich corridors may have offered food, navigational logic, and relatively favourable routes for small groups moving outward. Then the ice retreated, waters rose, campsites disappeared, entire landscapes were drowned. The first great highways of human dispersal may now lie silent under the sea. This possibility unsettles the old habit of imagining migration only in terms of inland drama. Daring crossings, mountain passes, and stark overland marches. Such journeys surely mattered, but coastlines may have mattered just as much, perhaps more. Marine resources can be reliable. Coastal movement offers orientation. A shoreline provides continuity in a world where interior ecologies can be fragmented and unforgiving. Some researchers have long argued for the importance of southern coastal routes in the dispersal of Homo sapiens out of Africa and onward into Asia. The chronology and details remain debated, as they must in a story built from incomplete traces, but the broader suggestion carries weight. Human expansion may have followed edges, the seams between land and water, where evidence is least likely to survive. This is the recurring irony of the species' ascent. The more decisive a threshold may have been, the more likely it is to have occurred in places prehistory struggled to preserve. The sea, later romanticized as mystery or freedom, may also be one of the largest destroyers of the record. Its rise took not only camps and tools, but contexts, sequences, and habits that might have revealed how human beings first began stretching themselves across the inhabited world. And still the pattern of movement can be felt through what remains: genetic evidence, archaeological finds, and the distribution of ancient populations together suggest that Homo sapiens expanded out of Africa in waves, not necessarily as one singular exodus, but as a process with episodes, reversals, false starts, and branching dispersals. Some groups may have vanished after leaving little trace, others may have mingled with populations already present in Eurasia. Some routes likely succeeded because climate briefly opened windows that later closed again. The world did not simply invite expansion, it offered temporary permissions. Perhaps that is why the migrations feel less like conquest than like listening. A group moving into unfamiliar land must read weather, vegetation, prey patterns, danger, water, and season with extraordinary care. To survive, it must interpret what the landscape is saying, before the landscape finishes speaking through drought, storm, or hunger. In this sense, early expansion was not a reckless leap into emptiness. It was an extended act of attention. The human species moved not because the world had become easy, but because it had learned how to detect opportunities within difficulty. That learning did not remove fear. One can imagine small groups standing at the edge of unfamiliar terrain, carrying children, tools, embers, memories, obligations, and the pressure of uncertainty. Behind them, a known world that may no longer sustain them. Ahead, a new one without guarantees. There is something profoundly fragile in that image. The later rulers of continents began as migrants, who could not know if the next valley held water, if the next winter would be survivable, if strangers beyond the ridge would welcome or destroy them. To speak of dominion too early is to misread the emotional reality of those first expansions. They moved as vulnerable beings, not as masters. Yet vulnerability and reach can coexist. That is part of what makes humanity so difficult to classify beside other animals. Most species disperse within limits set tightly by ecology, instinct, and bodily specialization. Humans increasingly carried adaptive capacity and culture rather than anatomy alone. They could vary diet, tools, clothing, shelter, and social strategy across changing conditions. This did not make them invincible, it made them unusually transferable. A species once tied to particular African ecologies could gradually enter deserts, temperate woodlands, high latitudes, islands, and eventually almost every major habitat on the planet. Each expansion, however, may have required some kind of forgetting as well as remembering. The knowledge that served one environment could become a liability in another. Hunting strategies had to change. Materials differed. Plants that nourished in one region poisoned in another. Predators behaved differently. New stars may have governed direction. New illnesses waited in new ecologies. The migrating group had to retain enough continuity to remain itself, while also shedding habits that no longer fit. This tension between preservation and transformation would follow humanity through all later ages. But in prehistory it was a matter of immediate survival. There is a philosophical unease in this. If man became ruler of the earth by spreading everywhere, what exactly spread? Was there some stable human essence moving across continents unchanged? Or was humanity becoming itself precisely by changing from place to place? The evidence points toward both continuity and divergence. Populations adapted locally. Languages, tools, rituals, and appearances varied. Yet enough remained shared for the species to remain one broad human story. Perhaps the ruler of the earth was never a single fixed identity. Perhaps it was a moving pattern, a portable architecture of cooperation and imagination that could survive transformation without dissolving completely. The encounter with other human forms likely continued during some of these expansions. The movement outward was not into an empty theatre. Neanderthals already inhabited parts of Eurasia. Denisovans, too, were present in regions later entered by Homo sapiens. Migration therefore meant not only negotiation with climate and terrain, but with other humans whose histories had already taken root in those lands. Genes reveal contact. Archaeology suggests overlapping presence. The Earth's first truly global species may have become global, partly by passing through a mosaic of already occupied human worlds, and enduring the consequences of that contact. Some of the most haunting chapters of migration remain associated with places now difficult to reconstruct. The Arabian Peninsula during wetter phases, the Indian Ocean rim, island chains in Southeast Asia, the once exposed shelf known as Sunderland, the drowned landscapes linking what are now separate coasts, a child's footprint on wet sand there, a hearth on a shoreline, a shell midden by a tidal flat. Any of these might once have recorded a turning point in human dispersal. Now many such records lie beneath meters of water, inaccessible or destroyed. Prehistory, once again, asks to be read through loss. And still, the scale of the movement is astonishing. To leave one continent and gradually occupy so many others required more than endurance. It required accumulated trust in the possibility that the unknown could be crossed. That trust may have been one of humanity's quietest revolutions. Animals migrate, often with breathtaking precision, but usually within inherited patterns. Humans began to move beyond inherited worlds into landscapes no ancestor in living memory had necessarily described in full. Curiosity, pressure, necessity, ambition, accident. Some mixture of these drove the process. What matters is that the species did not stop at familiar horizons. By then, something subtle but irreversible had taken hold. Humanity no longer belonged only to one region. It had become a travelling force, capable of carrying its inner world outward until the boundaries of one habitat could no longer contain it. Yet that widening brought consequences not fully visible at first. Wherever humans went, they entered ecological systems shaped without them, or at least without them in that form and at that scale. The moving species would not remain a passive guest forever. Its arrival would begin to tilt balances, test the endurance of other creatures, and cast a longer shadow than migration alone could explain. For once the roads of the earth had been opened, however briefly. Who or what was left waiting at the far end of them? Once the roads of the earth had opened and human beings began entering landscapes that had evolved without their particular way of hunting, remembering and adapting, the silence of prehistory changed its tone. It was no longer only the silence of missing evidence or drowned shorelines. In many places it became the silence left behind by vanished giants, mammoths, mastodons, woolly rhinoceroses, giant ground sloths, enormous marsupials, cave bears, giant deer, and many other large animals once moved through the same world that humans were steadily learning to cross. Their size alone can still trouble the imagination. They belonged to a planet that seemed broader, heavier, less domesticated by scale. And yet, one by one, so many of them disappeared. The timing is not always exact. The causes are not always agreed upon. But the shadow of humanity stands nearby often enough that the question refuses to fade. What happens when a vulnerable species becomes so adaptable that its arrival begins to alter the destinies of creatures far larger than itself? That may be one of the most unsettling thresholds in the rise of man. To master fire, to migrate, to carry memory across climates. These still feel like forms of resilience. But once the presence of humans starts appearing beside extinction, the story darkens. Survival begins to look like pressure. Adaptation begins to cast a cost. For much of the 20th century, arguments about prehistoric extinctions hardened into opposing camps. Some researchers emphasize climate change, noting that the late Pleistocene and the transition into the Holocene brought profound environmental shifts. Warming temperatures, melting ice, changing vegetation, altered water systems, ecological fragmentation. Others stressed the role of human hunting, sometimes in dramatic terms, suggesting that newly arrived people could have hunted naive megafauna rapidly enough to contribute decisively to their collapse. These positions were often framed too sharply, as though one force had to exclude the other. But the earth rarely works through single causes, and history almost never does. More recent thinking in many cases has moved toward complexity. Climate stress, habitat disruption, reproductive vulnerability, and human predation or disturbance interacting in different ways across different regions. Complexity, however, does not diminish the emotional force of the problem. It may even deepen it. A species does not need to slaughter every giant directly in order to help end its world. It may be enough to arrive at the wrong ecological moment, to hunt selectively, to compete for resources, to alter fire regimes, to frighten animals into less stable patterns, to disrupt slow reproductive cycles already strained by changing climate. Extinction can emerge not from one catastrophe, but from several pressures converging until a population no longer recovers. In this sense, the rise of humanity may have begun leaving scars long before cities, metallurgy, or empire. The wound may already have been opening in the age of mammoths. This is especially haunting because many of these large animals had survived enormous climatic fluctuations before humans entered their final histories in those regions. Mammoths endured repeated cold phases. Giant marsupials in Australia had already lived through severe environmental changes. The Earth was never gentle with them, yet they remained. Then, in many places, a new variable appears: human arrival. The chronology differs by continent and species, and no responsible reading of the evidence can flatten those differences. But across Eurasia, Australia, the Americas, and islands around the world, there is a recurrent unease. The species that once looked so breakable had become, by cooperation and intelligence, a new kind of predator, one not defined by fang or claw, but by planning, flexibility, persistence, and the ability to enter almost any habitat carrying tools, fire, and shared knowledge. Australia often enters this conversation like a warning written in dust. Human arrival on that continent tens of thousands of years ago seems to have been followed by the disappearance of much of its megafauna, including giant kangaroos, enormous wombat-like diprotodon, massive reptiles, and strange marsupial predators. Debate continues over timing, mechanisms, and the degree to which climate and human pressures overlapped. Yet the scale of loss remains difficult to contemplate without sensing that something irreversible had occurred. A continent once inhabited by creatures of extraordinary size and peculiarity grew quieter after human settlement. The same pattern, though with local variations, appears again elsewhere. The Americas carry perhaps the most emotionally charged version of the question. Mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, glyptodonts, and many others vanished during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. Human groups moved into these lands while climates were shifting dramatically. The timing of human dispersal into the Americas has become more complicated in recent years, with evidence suggesting deeper antiquity and multiple routes still under investigation. But however early or complex the entry, the broad problem remains. Giant animals disappeared as humans spread. Whether one emphasizes overhunting, ecological cascades, landscape modification, or the cumulative impact of several interacting forces, the result is the same. A world of great bodies receded, and the species left standing was the one carrying stories, weapons, and fire. There is a temptation to imagine this as deliberate domination, but prehistory rarely grants such clean motives. Early humans were not industrial destroyers armed with theories of supremacy. They were foragers, hunters, migrants, parents, survivors. They killed to eat, to endure winters, to support communities balanced precariously against starvation. Yet moral innocence is not guaranteed by necessity. Consequences remain, whether intended or not. The extinction of megafauna may not require villainy to feel tragic. It requires only the recognition that a clever and cooperative species can transform the living world simply by becoming too effective within it. And perhaps that is the beginning of true rulership in its most troubling sense. The ruler of the earth is not merely the one who occupies it. It is the one whose behavior reorganizes the possibilities of other lives. By that measure, human beings may have begun ruling long before they understood the scale of what they were doing. They move through ecosystems as both participants and disruptors. The old balance did not always have defenses against a predator that could learn, coordinate, adapt, and persist across seasons and terrains. The giants, for all their size, may have been facing something evolution had never previously prepared them for. There is another loss hidden inside this extinction story. Large animals do more than fill landscapes physically. They shape them. They trample vegetation, disperse seeds, disturb soil, create pathways, alter nutrient cycles, and participate in complex ecological networks. Remove them, and the land itself begins to change. The disappearance of megafauna was not only the disappearance of spectacle, it was a reconfiguration of entire systems. Human ascent, therefore, may have involved not just standing above animals, but inheriting landscapes already transformed by their removal. Later generations would call such worlds natural without remembering what had been erased from them. That forgetting matters. A silence repeated long enough begins to sound normal. A forest without giant browsers becomes ordinary to those born after the loss. A grassland without mammoths no longer feels diminished to people who never saw one. Human history is full of such adjusted baselines, each generation mistaking a reduced world for the original one. Perhaps this habit began deep in prehistory. The first rulers of the earth may also have been the first creatures to normalize the quiet after disappearance. Yet even now, certainty remains out of reach. Not every extinction can be laid simply at human feet. Climate was real. Ecological fragility was real. Regional differences matter. The evidence resists moral theatre and demands patience. But patience does not erase the larger pattern. The more humans expanded, the more the world of giants contracted. That parallel is too persistent to dismiss as coincidence. So the journey continues under a darker light. The species that survived instability, outlasted rival humans, kept fire, and crossed continents was no longer merely moving through the earth. It was beginning to alter the earth's living composition. The cost of human success had started to appear in absence, in hoofbeats no longer heard, in massive shadows withdrawn from plains and forests, in evolutionary lineages broken forever. And once a species begins changing the fate of other species on that scale, another question rises from the silence they leave behind. If humans could help empty the world of giants while still living as foragers, what would happen when they learned not only to hunt nature, but to reorganize it? Once human beings began altering the fate of other creatures, another transformation was already taking shape within them, quieter than migration, and less visible than extinction, yet perhaps even more decisive. It is one thing to survive the world, and another to reshape it. But there is a third threshold, more difficult to measure and stranger to contemplate. The moment a species begins to organize not only matter but meaning. A hunted animal becomes more than food. A cave becomes more than shelter. The dead become more than bodies. A hill, a grove, a chamber of stone, a painted wall, a carefully prepared burial place. Such things suggest that human beings were no longer merely moving through the earth. They were beginning to divide it into layers of significance. This change is among the hardest to date precisely because meaning, like speech, rarely fossilizes in a form that explains itself. Archaeology can reveal a body placed in a certain position, red ochre scattered across bones, tools, or ornaments laid beside the dead, repeated use of caves deep beyond ordinary habitation, carved figurines, decorated surfaces, arranged skulls, or circles of stone raised in places that seem to exceed practical need. These traces are powerful, but they are also mute. They do not tell later ages exactly what was believed, feared, remembered, or invoked. They only tell us that practical life was no longer the whole of life. And perhaps that is where human rule began to deepen in a new direction. If fire allowed early people to hold back the night, and language allowed them to share invisible worlds, ritual allowed them to stabilize those worlds across time. A repeated act is never just an act. It becomes a pattern. A pattern becomes expectation. Expectation becomes order. Whether around death, hunting, fertility, ancestors, seasons, or places, felt to be charged with presence, ritual turns fleeting emotion into durable structure. It gives communities a way to return to the same meaning again and again, until that meaning begins to feel older than those who perform it. Burial practices offer some of the most haunting signs of this development. In several prehistoric contexts, bodies appear to have been treated with care beyond simple disposal. The dead were placed deliberately, sometimes in curled positions, sometimes with pigments, ornaments, or objects nearby. The interpretation of any single burial is never simple. Caution is necessary, because the temptation to project later religious systems backward is always strong. Yet even caution cannot erase the deeper impression. To treat the dead in patterned ways is to resist the natural anonymity of decomposition. It is to say, however quietly, that this person does not vanish into matter without acknowledgement. That acknowledgement may have changed human society profoundly. A group that remembers its dead in ritualized form is no longer composed only of the living. It becomes haunted in the deepest and most creative sense. The absent remain socially active. They influence behavior, memory, territory, identity, and obligation. An ancestor, once imagined as continuing in some form, can become a source of cohesion stronger than fear alone. A burial ground can anchor a people to place. The dead, paradoxically, may help create permanence for the living. This possibility is unsettling because it suggests that human dominion over the earth may have relied partly on an ability to populate the world with invisible presences. Once the land is no longer just land, but ancestral land, sacred land, forbidden land, promised land, burial land, or land watched over by powers beyond the visible, behaviour changes. A landscape becomes governed not merely by terrain and weather, but by belief. And belief, unlike instinct, can extend across generations with astonishing tenacity. A place marked by ritual becomes difficult to abandon completely, even when practical life changes. Meaning roots people in the earth as surely as food does. Caves occupy a particularly mysterious place in this process. Deep cave art, especially in places far from natural light, does not feel accidental. To enter those spaces carrying flame into stone chambers where sound alters and darkness presses from every side required effort and intention. Why go there? Why paint animals beyond the zone of ordinary dwelling? Why leave handprints in remote chambers as if to touch the wall and remain? Scholars have proposed hunting rites, shamanic trance, teaching, cosmological symbolism, territorial expression, initiation, and combinations of these possibilities. No single answer has ended the debate, nor should it. The cave may have been many things at once, but what matters is that humans were entering darkness not merely to survive it, but to mark it. That urge to mark may be one of the earliest expressions of earthly sovereignty, not sovereignty in the political sense, not yet, but in the symbolic sense. The world begins to bear human signs. Stone receives pigment, bodies receive adornment, bones receive ceremony, spaces receive narrative weight. Once a species starts inscribing significance onto matter, it no longer inhabits the earth on the same terms as other animals. It begins converting terrain into memory and memory into authority. There is also a more intimate dimension. Ritual may have provided psychological continuity in a world still full of loss. Climate instability, dangerous hunts, infant mortality, injury, and the ever-present nearness of death would have made grief a constant companion in early human life. To ritualize grief is not to remove pain. It is to frame pain within a pattern, to prevent it from dissolving the group. A funeral, a burial, a repeated gesture, a place of return. These are forms of emotional architecture. They protect the mind by giving sorrow somewhere to go. And a species that can protect its inner life collectively becomes more resilient than one that depends on instinct alone. This may explain why symbolic and ritual behavior persisted even under harsh conditions. It was not a luxury added after survival had been secured. It may have been part of survival itself. A people that can maintain cohesion through loss, interpret suffering within a shared world, and bind generations through stories of the dead possesses a strength not easily measured in muscle or tool complexity. Such strength does not glitter in the archaeological record, but its effects accumulate quietly. Communities last longer. Knowledge persists. Places matter. Identity thickens. And yet ritual carries an ambiguity that will only grow heavier in later ages. The same structures that preserve meaning can also control it. Once certain places become sacred, access can be regulated. Once ancestors become sources of authority, someone may claim to speak for them. Once the invisible governs behavior, those who interpret the invisible acquire influence. In the deep prehistoric record, this is only a shadow, not yet full domination. But the shadow is there. The power to organize meaning is never neutral for long. Perhaps that is why the earlier sacred spaces feel both beautiful and faintly ominous. A painted cave, a ceremonial burial, a carved figure, a repeated gesture over the dead, all these testify to depth, imagination, reverence, and a refusal to let life collapse into bare materiality. But they also hint at the beginning of another hierarchy, one built not from teeth or physical force, but from interpretation. The human species was learning not only how to survive the world and alter it, but how to explain it in forms that could outlast individuals. That is an immense kind of power. The ruler of the earth, then, may not first have ruled through agriculture or kingship or armies. Those came later. A more ancient rulership may have begun in this quieter sphere, when humans learned to govern one another through shared symbols, collective memory, and sacred attention. A burial site can hold a people together. A ritual can coordinate behavior more deeply than command. A story about the dead can shape the living long after the teller is gone. In such ways, the species began building invisible structures more durable than wood or hide. Still, nothing was settled. Meaning spread unevenly. Rituals differed from place to place. The dead remained silent, even when honoured. The painted wall did not reveal its final message. And perhaps that unfinished quality is essential. Human beings were not yet masters of certainty. They were apprentices of significance, learning how to make the world feel inhabited by more than what the eye could see. But once that lesson took hold, another transformation waited beyond it. If the species had learned to fill caves, graves, and landscapes with invisible order, what would happen when it discovered that plants, animals, and seasons themselves could also be drawn into systems of control? Once human beings had learned to fill landscapes with memory, caves with signs, and the dead with continuing presence, it may have seemed that the species had already crossed the deepest threshold available to it. Yet another transformation was approaching, one so consequential that later civilizations would mistake it for the natural destiny of humankind. It did not begin with a king, a temple, or a written law. It began with a slower and more intimate rearrangement. The taming of cycles, the watching of seeds, the return to the same ground, the quiet recognition that certain plants could be encouraged, certain animals enclosed, and certain seasons anticipated closely enough to make settlement seem possible. But if this was the beginning of man's rule over the earth, it was also the beginning of a subtler submission. The species that domesticated the land may, in the same motion, have begun domesticating itself. The agricultural transition has often been described as a revolution, though that word can mislead by making the change sound sudden, universal, and clear. In reality, it unfolded unevenly across different regions and times. In the Fertile Crescent, the cultivation of wheat, barley, lentils, and other plants emerged gradually across millennia. Elsewhere, rice, millet, sorghum, maize, potatoes, yams, and other crops entered human history through their own local trajectories. Animal domestication followed complex paths as well, involving sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, dogs, and others in different combinations. There was no single moment at which humanity ceased to be foraging and became agricultural. For long periods, both worlds overlapped, but overlap does not make the shift less profound. It only makes it more haunting, because people were not leaping into an unknown future. They were drifting into a new dependency whose full cost could not yet be seen. At first glance, the appeal seems obvious. A planted field promises return. A herd enclosed behind human intention offers a kind of stored movement, life held in reserve. Grain can be dried, counted, guarded, redistributed. A people tethered to productive land may support more children. Structures become less temporary. Memory attaches itself not only to sacred sites and burial places, but to houses, walls, paths, and boundaries repeated season after season. In such conditions, the earth begins to look less like a shifting stage of opportunity and danger, and more like something that can be organized. But organization has a temperament of its own. The field demands return. The granary demands protection. The herd demands supervision. Sowing and harvest impose calendars more rigid than the fluid opportunism of many foraging lives. Sedentism changes the body as well as the landscape. Labour intensifies in repetitive ways. Diets can narrow even when calories become more predictable. Disease may spread more easily where humans, waste, and domesticated animals remain in close proximity. Archaeological and biological evidence in some early agricultural populations suggests that the first farmers were not always healthier than the foragers who preceded them. In certain contexts, stature declined, workloads increased, and signs of stress accumulated in bone and tooth. The earth was yielding to human planning, yes, but perhaps only by binding humans more tightly to its demands. This is the first great paradox of settled life. Agriculture appears to increase control over food, yet it also increases vulnerability to failure. A hunting band can move if resources shift. A farming village invested in fixed fields cannot abandon them lightly. Drought, blight, flood, locusts, soil depletion, or conflict can threaten not just one meal, but the entire structure of life. The more productive the system becomes, the more catastrophic its interruption can be. The ruler of the earth begins to emerge at precisely the moment he becomes entangled in systems that can punish him at a greater scale. There is something almost theological in this bargain. To plant is to place trust in time. To settle is to gamble that the future will remain legible enough for planning to matter. The foraging mind reads variability. The agricultural mind tries to shape it. Both require intelligence, but they orient the human spirit differently. One flows with moving abundance and scarcity. The other seeks recurrence, storage, permanence. Neither world is simple, and romanticizing either one would betray the record. Yet the emotional shift matters. Once people begin living by planted cycles, they also begin thinking in ways more receptive to possession, inheritance, obligation, and hierarchy. Because surplus changes the moral weather of a society. What can be stored can be counted. What can be counted can be controlled. What can be controlled can be guarded, exchanged, taxed, seized, or inherited. A hunter may return with meat, but grain stacked in one place lingers long enough to become a political fact. Fields demand boundary. Boundaries require enforcement. Enforcement privileges some voices over others. The first seeds of authority may have been sown beside the first seeds of grain. This does not mean early agricultural communities were instantly oppressive or uniformly stratified. Many likely remained cooperative, local, and fluid in ways that later empires would no longer tolerate. But the structural possibilities had changed. Once life depends on fixed resources and seasonal labour, roles begin to harden. The able-bodied are needed at certain times with greater intensity. Land matters in a way mobile territory does not. Kinship acquires new economic meaning. Women's labour, men's labour, children's labour, elder knowledge, all are drawn into new patterns. Birth rates may rise because settlement can support more dependent children, but those children arrive into worlds that may already be narrowing around obligations. Perhaps this is why some thinkers have viewed agriculture less as liberation than as a trap. That judgment may go too far if stated absolutely, but it speaks to a real unease. The species that once moved through landscapes reading opportunity began building lives in which leaving became harder, labour more repetitive, and inequality more imaginable. A field can feed many, but it can also anchor them to routines that are no longer negotiable. In that sense, the first great act of ruling nature may also have been the first large-scale surrender to schedule. And yet the transformation carried undeniable power. Agricultural life made larger, denser populations possible. It enabled durable settlement, craft specialization, expanded exchange, and eventually the conditions from which cities, priesthoods, and states would emerge. None of that was guaranteed, but the trajectory had begun. Plants and animals entered human systems and were altered by them. Wheat became inseparable from human cultivation. Sheep, cattle, and goats moved within expanding webs of breeding, transport, and sacrifice. The boundary between nature and human design grew more porous. Life itself was being reorganized. The psychological consequences may have been just as deep. A forager entering a forest encounters a world already formed. A farmer looking across a field sees a world increasingly shaped by intention. This fosters a different relation to earth. Soil becomes resource. Rain becomes requirement. Animals become property. Time becomes yield. The world is no longer only a place to navigate, fear, honour, and interpret. It is also a place to manage. That managerial impulse, still modest in early villages, would later expand into one of the defining energies of civilization. But the old sacredness did not vanish. It changed form. Agricultural societies often became intensely ritualized around fertility, harvest, flood, drought, and seasonal return. The invisible order previously attached to caves, ancestors, and wandering landscapes now settled into fields, planted cycles, and domesticated life. The gods, where they emerged, increasingly watched grain, weather, and reproductive abundance. This suggests that agriculture did not replace meaning with utility. It fused them. Food production became cosmological. Survival and symbolism tightened their embrace. That fusion may have helped legitimize the new burdens. If labour is not merely labour, but participation in sacred order, then obedience deepens. If land is not merely productive, but inherited through ancestors or granted by divine pattern, then boundary grows heavier. If the harvest depends not only on technique but on ritual correctness, then interpreters of the sacred begin to matter more. The old power of organizing meaning now attaches itself to subsistence. A dangerous combination is taking shape, and still the change was never total. Foraging persisted in many regions for millennia. Mixed economies endured. Some people resisted settlement, some returned from it, some adopted only parts of the agricultural package. Human history rarely moves in clean replacement. But the larger current was unmistakable. A species once defined by mobility, flexibility, and portable culture had started building fixed worlds that could outlast individuals and concentrate power. This is why the agricultural threshold feels so heavy in the long story of human rule. It did not merely increase production, it altered the grammar of existence. The earth became partitioned, stored, inherited, and supervised. The human body became more disciplined by season and task. Communities grew denser. Memory took architectural form. Time itself began to harden into obligation. The ruler of the earth was no longer just the creature that survived instability and crossed continents. He was becoming the creature who could compel landscapes to repeat themselves, at least for a while. But repetition has its own appetite. Once grain fills a storehouse and fields circle a settlement, another hunger awakens, one not satisfied by food alone. Who guards the surplus? Who decides the boundary? Who speaks for the ancestors, the gods, the law of the field, the right to command labour? The first villages may not yet have known how dangerous these questions would become, yet they were already there, waiting inside every wall built to protect a harvest from the world beyond it. Once a harvest can be counted, a boundary defended, and a surplus guarded through the seasons, the village is already leaning towards something larger than itself. It does not need to know this. The people who stack grain, repair walls, tend animals, and bury their dead near familiar ground may still believe they are only preserving life against uncertainty. Yet storage has its own gravity. It attracts obligation, envy, dependence, and ambition. What begins as protection slowly becomes structure. What begins as structure begins asking to be managed, and what asks to be managed eventually calls forth a new kind of human figure, not the hunter, not the elder alone, not the ritual keeper by the fire, but the organizer, the recorder, the distributor, the one who decides how order should outlast the moment. Somewhere in that shift, the story of man ruling the earth becomes inseparable from the story of man ruling other men. The earlier cities did not rise from nothing. They condensed from layers of repetition, sowing, storing, exchanging, repairing, measuring, remembering, fearing attack, anticipating shortage, invoking divine favour, settling disputes over land and inheritance. In places like southern Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the Indus region, northern China, and elsewhere in their own distinct ways, settlement thickened into complexity. Mud brick became architecture rather than mere shelter. Temples and communal structures emerged. Trade routes lengthened. Labour differentiated. A city, in its earliest form, is not simply a large village. It is a machine for concentrating people, goods, meanings, and decisions into a space dense enough to alter the scale of human life. That density changes everything. In a small band or village, memory can remain personal. People know who contributed, who failed, who owes, who belongs. But when population expands beyond the reach of direct familiarity, memory becomes strained. Trust can no longer depend only on face-to-face continuity. Surplus must be tracked. Debts must be acknowledged. Storehouses must be audited. Rations must be distributed. Offerings must be accounted for. Ownership and obligation begin to exceed what spoken agreement alone can carry. It is here, at this pressure point between abundance and confusion, that one of the most consequential inventions in human history emerges: writing. And yet writing, like every other decisive threshold in this story, does not first appear as poetry or revelation. It appears under pressure. In Mesopotamia, the earliest written marks are closely associated with accounting, commodities, administrative needs, and the management of stored wealth. Before writing came in the fuller literary sense, there were tokens, impressions, tallies, proto-administrative systems trying to hold complexity in visible form. This matters because it reminds us that the written word did not begin as pure expression. It began, in significant part, as an answer to the problem of control. There is something eerie in that. Speech vanishes when air stops carrying it. Ritual remains only if bodies repeat it. Memory fades, distorts, dies with those who hold it. But writing leaves a trace outside the body. A mark on clay can outlive the hand that made it. A transaction can survive the merchant. A decree can survive the ruler. A prayer can survive the priest. For the first time in a sustained way, human intention could be stabilized in material form and carried beyond immediate presence. This did not merely preserve thought, it changed who could wield thought effectively at scale. Because once records exist, forgetting is no longer innocent. It becomes selective. What is written acquires a different kind of authority from what is only remembered. The grain counted on the tablet begins to matter more than the spoken protest of the labourer. The boundary inscribed carries different weight from the boundary implied by custom. The genealogy recorded for a ruling line takes on the appearance of permanence. Writing does not simply store reality, it helps decide which reality will be treated as official. This is the beginning of a new and subtler dominion. Earlier humans had learned to command fire, coordinate through language, migrate across continents, and bind communities through ritual. Now they were learning to fix order into durable signs. The earth, already partitioned by agriculture, could now be partitioned by record. Land, labour, surplus, temple obligations, tribute, law, these become legible in new ways. Legibility sounds harmless, even rational, but it has a hidden edge. What can be made legible can be monitored. What can be monitored can be controlled. The ruler of the earth is becoming the ruler of inventories. Temples often stood near the centre of this early order, and that is no accident. Religion and administration were not neatly separate spheres in many early societies. To count grain and to honour the gods could belong to the same institutional world. Offerings flowed into sacred precincts. Priests and administrators might overlap in function or legitimacy. This fusion made the system stronger. Surplus could be justified cosmologically. Authority could be described not merely as useful, but as rightful, even necessary for maintaining harmony between heaven, earth, flood, harvest, and community. The invisible order, once carried by ritual around graves and sacred sites, was now attaching itself to bureaucracy. One can feel the significance of this without needing to reduce it to cynicism. The early city was not only an apparatus of oppression, it also made possible astonishing acts of coordination. Irrigation systems, long-distance trade, skilled craftsmanship, monumental building, shared calendars, collective cult practice, and new forms of cultural continuity all grew within these dense systems. Human beings were learning to sustain complexity across generations. They were building worlds that no single lifetime could contain. That is a real achievement. But achievements of scale always invite asymmetry. Once some people manage records, allocate labour, interpret divine order, or command walls and storehouses, social distance thickens. The person who tills the field and the person who tallies the yield do not inhabit power equally. The one whose family lives by the floodplain and the one whose seal marks an order on clay do not stand in the same relation to truth. The city gathers many lives together, but it does not gather them evenly. Hierarchy begins to settle into architecture, and architecture remembers what people prefer to forget. A large wall is more than defence. It is also the visible claim that what lies within deserves protection from what lies beyond. A palace is more than a residence. It is concentrated authority in brick and timber and decorated surface. A temple is more than worship. It is the meeting point of cosmic order and institutional power. Streets, gates, courtyards, granaries, workshops, and administrative quarters all become spatial arguments about who matters, who labours, who decides, and who records the decision. This is where the human ascent becomes difficult to separate from narrative control. Earlier parts of the story were haunted by missing evidence, drowned paths, vanished species, and erased companions. But now erasure takes on a more intentional form. Once scribes, officials, and ruling institutions possessed durable systems of record, memory itself can be curated. Victories can be preserved, defeats softened, taxes normalized, dynasties glorified, divine sanction repeated until it hardens into fact. Even when the record is honest in part, it is never neutral in total. The archive begins choosing. That choice matters immensely because later generations inherit not only events, but filtered events. The first official histories may not have set out to deceive in the way modern suspicion imagines, yet they still emerge from structures that benefited from coherence, legitimacy, and order. A king who rules by divine favour is easier to obey if tablets and monuments echo the claim. A system of labour extraction is easier to sustain if it appears woven into cosmic necessity. The city does not merely gather bodies, it gathers explanations, and perhaps that is the deeper threshold crossed here. Man's rule over the earth is no longer just ecological or symbolic. It has become administrative. The human world can now reproduce itself through records, institutions, and regulated memory. A child born inside such a system does not inherit only land and language. That child inherits schedules, obligations, categories, stories about legitimacy, and a built environment already telling him where authority resides. Power becomes less visible as force and more visible as structure. Yet structure, for all its permanence, remains fragile. Floods still come, harvests still fail, rival cities still threaten, disease still enters crowded streets. The gods, despite elaborate systems of devotion, do not always protect the orderly from ruin. This is the irony at the heart of the first cities. The more humans organize their world, the more they expose themselves to disruptions on a new scale. A failed crop now endangered dense populations. A breached wall imperiled accumulated wealth. A corrupted record could distort justice itself. The system that magnified human power also magnified the cost of its collapse. Still, the direction had become unmistakable. The species that once moved lightly through unstable landscapes was now laying down weight. Walls, ledgers, monuments, and names designed to endure. The earth was no longer merely crossed, hunted, painted, buried into, or planted. It was being administered. But once administration hardens into legitimacy, another danger begins to gather behind it. If writing can preserve law, debt, and divine order, then it can also preserve command. And once command learns to travel through institutions rather than through memory alone, who will stop it from reaching beyond the city and asking the surrounding world to kneel? Once command learns to travel through walls, records, temples, and storehouses, it rarely remains content within the boundaries that first gave it shape. Order begins to lean outward. A city that can count grain can also count men. A ruler who can catalogue tribute can imagine more tribute. A priesthood that binds the cosmos to one centre can persuade a population that expansion is not merely ambition, but necessity, duty, or divine design. And so another threshold opens in the long ascent of man, the movement from organised settlement to organised force. The earth is no longer only administered, it is pressed, divided, defended, and taken. There is something coldly transformative about metal in this story. Stone had served humanity for immense stretches of time, faithfully and with astonishing versatility. But metal altered the relationship between effort and effect. Copper, then bronze, and later iron, did more than improve tools and weapons. They intensified asymmetry. A sharper blade changes the terms of a struggle. A stronger axe changes the fate of a forest. A more durable plough changes the output of land. Metallurgy is not simply invention, it is acceleration. Human intention enters matter, and matter returns the favour by extending human reach beyond what bone, wood, and chipped stone could sustain. The earliest metal workers may not have imagined the scale of consequence unfolding in their furnaces. They worked with fire and ore, with patience, trial, and specialised knowledge. Yet specialisation itself is part of the story. Once societies become complex enough to support smiths, soldiers, administrators, priests, traders, and labourers in differentiated roles, power no longer rests only in the courage or cunning of individuals. It begins to settle into systems of production. A weapon is not just held by a warrior. It is made possible by miners, smelters, transport routes, controlled fuel, guarded workshops, and the authorities who direct or monopolise these processes. Violence becomes infrastructural. That word may seem too modern for ancient worlds, but the principle is old. A raid is one thing, a campaign is another. To sustain warfare across distance requires grain, carts, roads, or navigable rivers, disciplined bodies, and some shared conviction that the losses will serve a larger order. In this way, the rise of war at organised scale reveals something unsettling about humanity's growing mastery. It's not enough to survive nature, to shape meaning, to plant fields, or to write decrees. The species increasingly learns how to convert stored energy, food, fuel, labour, metallurgy, obedience, into coercion. And coercion, once systematised, leaves deep marks on the earth. Fortifications rise, borderlands harden, captives are taken. Tributary routes stretch outward from centres of authority. Landscapes once crossed by mobile peoples or loosely organised communities become enclosed by regimes of extraction. The earth begins to feel different under such conditions. It is no longer merely inhabited. It is claimed in ways backed by force. This is where the story of human dominion becomes difficult to romanticize. Intelligence alone does not build empires. Cooperation alone does not hold them. Something harsher enters the process. Discipline. The body must be trained to obey commands. The hand must strike when ordered. The farmer must surrender part of the harvest. The labourer must build walls not for personal shelter, but for state defence. The scribe must register dues. The messenger must ride. The conquered must learn the cost of resistance. Human beings, who once adapted to unstable climates through flexible movement and shared memory, now become components inside machines of order whose purpose may extend far beyond their own interests. That transformation can be glimpsed in the great early states and empires of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Anatolia, China, the Andes, Mesoamerica, and elsewhere in their distinct historical paths. The details differ profoundly, and no single model can contain them, but across many regions a recurring pattern emerges. Surplus enables hierarchy, hierarchy supports specialization, specialization sharpens military capacity, and military capacity protects or expands the very structures that created it. Power loops back on itself and grows denser. It no longer needs to persuade every individual directly. It can compel through institutions. There is a certain philosophical sadness in this. The same capacities that once helped fragile communities survive, memory, cooperation, symbolic order, planning, are now harnessed to domination. Language that once coordinated hunts can command armies. Ritual that once held grief can sanctify kingship. Writing that once tracked grain can enumerate tribute and prisoners. Even metallurgy, born from patient experimentation with earth and flame, can serve the spearhead as readily as the ploughshare. The ascent of man reveals itself more clearly here as morally double. Every extension of human capacity can nourish or wound. Often it does both at once, and yet one should be careful not to turn ancient societies into caricatures of cruelty alone. Organised states also generated law, monumental art, astronomy, engineering, irrigation, and traditions of literature and philosophical reflection that would outlive their rulers. They built systems capable of preserving knowledge over centuries. They expanded the scale at which strangers could coexist within a common order, however unequal that order might be. Power is rarely pure. It shelters and extracts, creates and consumes, gathers and crushes. Still, the shadow remains. The ruler of the earth increasingly resembles the creature able not only to alter environments, but to marshal other humans in the service of that alteration. This may be the most consequential development of all. One person is biologically limited. A state is not limited in the same way. A state can command thousands of bodies, concentrate resources across seasons, and direct violence with continuity beyond individual lifetimes. Once such a structure exists, the human relation to the earth changes radically. Mountains are quarried more deeply. Rivers are redirected more ambitiously. Roads are laid not merely to travel but to govern. Forests fall in measured campaigns. Minds descend further into darkness. The planet begins to feel the pressure of organized intention. This pressure is not only physical, it is temporal. States think in longer arcs than many individuals can afford to. They plan dynastically, ritually, agriculturally, militarily. Calendars are refined. Tax cycles stabilize. Borders are watched. Archives grow. A people living within such systems may come to experience time itself as administered. The sowing season, the levy, the festival, the conscription, the tribute caravan, the rebuilding of the wall. These rhythms shape existence as much as rain or drought once did. Nature remains powerful, but human institutions increasingly compete with it for control over daily life. And with that competition comes another quiet danger: normalization. What begins as extraordinary force becomes ordinary order if repeated long enough. A generation born inside fortified cities and administrative states may come to regard taxation, military service, legal hierarchy, and dynastic authority as natural features of human existence, rather than as historical constructions. The machine of rule succeeds most completely when it no longer feels like a machine. It feels like reality. Perhaps this is why ancient rulers so often wrap themselves in cosmic language. To command bodies through fear is effective, but incomplete. To command them through inevitability is stronger. A king is not merely obeyed because soldiers stand nearby, but because the king is presented as the axis between heaven and earth, the guarantor of flood, justice, fertility, victory, continuity. This does not mean people were simply deceived. Belief can be sincere and politically useful at once. The point is subtler. As human systems of power grew more expansive, they increasingly required stories large enough to justify their weight. Such stories would matter greatly in what followed. Because once force can be organized, sanctified, and recorded, it begins to move beyond mere defense or local rivalry. It becomes imperial in instinct. The city asks the countryside for labor. The kingdom asks neighboring peoples for tribute. The empire asks the horizon for submission. Human rulership over the earth is becoming less metaphorical now. Not total, certainly not yet, but broader, harder, more self-aware. The species is learning how to impose order beyond the circle of kin and beyond the limits of one valley. But imposition always carries a cost hidden within its triumph. Every wall announces fear as much as power. Every army consumes the harvest it claims to protect. Every empire extends itself toward fragility even as it glorifies its reach. The more humanity learns to command through metal, record, and discipline, the more it builds systems capable of collapse at terrifying scale. And somewhere inside that contradiction, between expansion and instability, between grandeur and exhaustion, another question begins to gather. If man had learned to organize force strongly enough to subdue other men and bend entire landscapes to administrative will, what story would he next tell himself in order to believe that such rule was not only possible, but sacred? Once force has been organized, disciplined, recorded, and sanctified, it no longer needs to justify itself only through victory. It begins to seek something deeper than fear, something more durable than the memory of conquest. A city can dominate for a season through walls and soldiers. A kingdom can extract tribute through threat. But an enduring order usually asks for more than obedience. It asks to be believed. And when belief reaches its fullest political form, it does something extraordinary. It rearranges not only society but the cosmos itself. The ruler is no longer merely strong. The ruler becomes necessary. The boundary is no longer merely defended. It becomes sacred. The earth is no longer merely inhabited. It is placed inside a story that explains why some people command and others serve. This may be one of the most decisive turns in the rise of man, and one of the most difficult to resist intellectually, because cosmology does not usually arrive as naked control. It arrives as meaning. It tells people where they stand in relation to the sky, The dead, the land, the flood, the stars, the cycles of fertility, the afterlife, the gods, or the hidden architecture of reality. Such systems can be sincere, profound, beautiful, and stabilizing. They can also become instruments of astonishing subtlety. For once a people believes that earthly order reflects heavenly order, disobedience begins to feel larger than politics. It becomes disorder in the fabric of existence. This is why the ancient world is filled with sacred geographies. Mountains become abodes of gods. Rivers become arteries of divine generosity or judgment. Capitals become centers not merely of administration, but of cosmic alignment. Temples rise as models of the universe in miniature, their layouts echoing celestial or mythic structure. Kings stand not only at the head of armies, but at the meeting point between human vulnerability and divine permanence. Across civilizations, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Vedic, Chinese, Mesoamerican, Andean, and many others in their own distinct forms, one finds recurring efforts to connect rulership with the order of the cosmos. This should not be mistaken for primitive confusion. These were not simple societies naively projecting fantasy onto the sky. They were often highly observant cultures, attentive to seasonal cycles, celestial movements, agricultural timing, and the psychological need for coherence in precarious worlds. Their cosmologies emerge from serious engagement with reality as they understood it. But seriousness does not cancel political effect. A flood that comes on time can validate a priesthood. A star calendar can strengthen those who interpret it. A ritual order tied to harvest can make authority feel as old as the heavens. In this way, knowledge and power begin to fuse even more tightly. That fusion is one of the quiet engines of human dominion. Earlier ages had learned how to survive climate, cross continents, shape landscapes, and organize labor. Now human beings were learning how to explain their systems as reflections of universal truth. The effect is immense. An imposed hierarchy may provoke resistance if it appears merely human. The same hierarchy becomes harder to challenge if it appears woven into the structure of reality itself. The king does not just sit on a throne. He occupies a cosmological position. The temple does not merely collect offerings. It mediates between visible order and invisible necessity. The law does not merely regulate life. It echoes divine measure. There is a certain tenderness in this, and a certain danger. Human beings have always needed frameworks large enough to contain suffering. Drought, plague, war, childbirth, old age, eclipse, crop failure, and death all demand interpretation. A cosmology can hold terror and make it bearable. It can teach humility before the vastness of the world. It can console the grieving and orient the lost. Yet the same symbolic architecture that protects the mind can also bind it. If a social structure is wrapped in sacred inevitability, then questioning it becomes spiritually costly. The invisible order does not merely comfort, it disciplines. Perhaps this is why official cosmologies so often grow around centers of power. A court, a temple complex, a ritual capital, a calendrical authority. These institutions do more than reflect belief. They standardize it. They gather local traditions, absorb them, reinterpret them, or suppress them. They decide which myths become central, which rituals are lawful, which gods are elevated, which lineages are sanctified, which maps of the world will be repeated. The process is rarely total, and unofficial beliefs always survive beneath the surface, but the tendency is clear. Once authority learns to curate cosmology, memory itself becomes more manageable. This is where the story begins to brush against a deeper suspicion. What if historical truth, even in ancient times, was never merely forgotten by accident, but softened, redirected, or enclosed inside official systems of interpretation? One need not imagine hidden conspiracies in the crude modern sense to feel the weight of the question. A priesthood guarding sacred texts, an empire unifying diverse territories, a dynasty legitimizing succession. a scholarly class standardizing doctrine. All of these have reasons to narrow the field of acceptable memory. The narrowing may feel pious, rational, or necessary, but it still narrows. And every narrowing leaves ghosts. Local gods become demons or vanish. Alternative origin stories survive only in fragments. Defeated peoples lose the right to explain the world on their own terms. Sacred places are repurposed. Temples are rebuilt over older shrines. Calendars are revised. Old rites are forbidden, absorbed, or renamed. Even when this process creates greater coherence, it also produces loss. The official map of reality becomes smoother than the world that preceded it. The roughness is buried, but never completely. This matters profoundly for the long question of how man became ruler of the earth. He did not rise by force alone. He rose by persuading himself that the earth was interpretable in human terms and eventually ordered toward human-centered structures. Once a society places itself near the center of cosmic significance, exploitation can feel like stewardship, expansion can feel like destiny, and hierarchy can feel like natural law. The world stops being an independent order full of inscrutable agencies and becomes a field to be named, administered, purified, or redeemed. That anthropocentric turn is not universal in identical form, and many traditions preserved more reciprocal or humble relations between humans and the larger living world. But across many major civilizations, the gravitational pull toward human centrality becomes difficult to ignore. Even when the cosmos is imagined as vast and terrifying, human institutions often claim privileged access to its meaning. This gives the species something close to metaphysical confidence. It no longer only survives and builds, it assumes interpretive authority. Interpretive authority, however, is one of the most dangerous forms of power because it can hide inside reverence. A people may bow before the sacred while also bowing before those who define what the sacred requires. Temples become archives. Archives become filters. Symbols become borders. Heresy emerges wherever alternative memory resists standard form. The invisible order, once a fragile human effort to live with mystery, can become a mechanism for policing mystery. And still, the picture must not be flattened into cynicism. Many of the world's greatest achievements in philosophy, ethics, astronomy, art, literature, and contemplative thought emerged within or alongside these sacred systems. Human beings asked luminous questions under temple roofs and starlit observatories. They sought truth as well as order. They pursued transcendence as well as legitimacy. That is what makes the matter so difficult. The structures that constrain also preserve. The systems that narrow memory also sometimes keep memory alive long enough for fragments of older worlds to survive within them. Perhaps that is why history so often feels layered rather than linear. Beneath official cosmologies lie older meanings. Beneath state rituals lie local rites. Beneath canonical stories lie competing memories that were never fully erased. The earth itself mirrors this with unsettling elegance. Cities built over ruins, temples raised over earlier sanctuaries, sacred precincts layered across centuries of reinterpretation. Human beings do not simply create order. They inherit it, rewrite it, sanctify it, and forget how much they have rewritten. The ruler of the earth, then, is no longer merely a hunter, migrant, farmer, scribe, or warrior. He is becoming a cartographer of reality, drawing lines not only across land but across meaning. He names the center, he names the sacred, he names the lawful path between heaven and soil. And once those names harden into institutions, they become difficult to challenge even when they are incomplete, selective, or born from conquest. This is the deeper tremor beneath the official stories of civilization. If human power had learned to sanctify itself, then every later empire, church, state, and intellectual order would inherit a dangerous possibility: the ability to claim not only that it governs the world, but that it understands what the world is for. And once a species begins to believe that, another horizon opens before it, one broader and more devastating than any ancient kingdom could imagine. If man had made himself the interpreter of the earth, what would happen when he began crossing oceans, measuring distant peoples and forcing the entire planet into one expanding map? Once human beings had learned to sanctify power, standardize memory, and place themselves near the center of cosmic explanation, the next expansion no longer required only armies on neighboring frontiers. It required ships, measurements, charts, compasses, mercantile hunger, and a new confidence that the world beyond the known horizon was not simply there to be feared, but to be entered, named, classified, and eventually absorbed. The earth, which had once seemed vast enough to dwarf every early settlement and kingdom, began to contract inside human systems of navigation and record. Coastlines were traced, winds were studied. Oceans ceased to be only barriers and became corridors, and with that shift, the old story of man ruling the earth passed into a more planetary phase, one in which distance itself was no longer protection. It is easy, from a later perspective, to call this age one of discovery, but the word carries a quiet violence. Lands were not waiting in blankness for strangers to notice them. Coasts already had names, rivers already carried memory, forests already belonged to systems of life and meaning older than the arriving ships. Peoples already mapped the world in their own ways, even when those maps were not drawn on parchment according to the conventions that European empires later privileged. To discover, in the imperial sense, often meant to overwrite recognition already present. The globe did not become newly known, it became newly claimed. That distinction matters because it reveals how power had evolved. Earlier rulers had sought tribute from valleys, river systems, and neighbouring peoples. Now expanding states and commercial networks were learning to convert the sea itself into an instrument of dominion. Navigation, astronomy, cartography, shipbuilding, finance, and military force fused into a system capable of crossing oceans with intent. Ports linked to ports, markets linked to extraction zones, knowledge linked to conquest. The map, once a symbolic rendering of sacred or political order, became an operational tool for expansion on a scale the ancient world could scarcely imagine. There is something almost spectral about a map in this period. It appears calm, rational, elegant. Lines, coasts, latitudes, names. Yet every line can conceal a wound. A drawn border may follow no local reality. A renamed bay may bury an older world. A route marked as trade may depend on coercion, displacement, or disease. The paper looks orderly because the disorder has been moved elsewhere, into forest cut for timber, mines dug by forced labour, villages emptied by epidemic, languages pushed towards silence, and bodies compelled to move where markets require. Human rule over the earth becomes less intimate here and more totalizing. It no longer needs to know a place deeply in order to dominate it. It only needs to integrate that place into a wider system. This is one of the coldest achievements of the species. Earlier forms of power depended heavily on proximity. A king could command only so far as messengers, roads, and armies could sustain his reach. But maritime empires and later colonial systems discovered how to govern across astonishing distance through a combination of trade monopolies, administrative routines, military outposts, missionary logic, and tax structures that translated local life into imperial value. The forest became timber reserves, the mountain became ore, the island became a port or plantation. The people became labour, tribute, souls to convert, or populations to classify and manage. Classification plays a crucial role here, and often receives less emotional attention than open conquest, though it can be equally transformative. To classify a people is already to position them. To classify a plant is to place it inside a system of use, exchange, and study. To classify land as empty, underused, uncivilized, or available is to prepare it for seizure in moral language. The sciences that developed alongside global expansion often generated genuine knowledge of extraordinary value, yet they also participated in ordering the world according to frameworks that served imperial reach. Observation and control became increasingly difficult to separate. There is a tragic irony in that. Human curiosity, one of the species' most luminous qualities, helped drive exploration, natural history, comparative linguistics, astronomy, and geographic understanding. Yet curiosity, once joined to extraction and state ambition, could become invasive. The desire to know a place blended with the desire to possess it. The cataloguing of species occurred beside the commodification of ecosystems. Ethnographic interest stood near racial hierarchy. Missionary passion stood beside cultural erasure. The ruler of the earth was no longer merely the one who survived and adapted. He was becoming the one who could turn knowledge itself into an arm of expansion. Disease deepened this transformation in ways no empire fully intended, but many exploited once the consequences became clear. The movement of people, animals, and pathogens across oceans shattered demographic worlds. In the Americas especially, epidemic disease devastated indigenous populations on a scale so immense that later conquest often unfolded through landscapes already broken by invisible catastrophe. One must be careful not to turn disease into an alibi, as though empires simply walked into emptiness created by microbes alone. Human choices magnified suffering through enslavement, warfare, resettlement, and systems of extraction imposed on weakened societies. Still, the biological dimension remains inseparable from the political one. The species that once survived ancient diseases through mobility and adaptation was now redistributing illness across the globe with unprecedented force. And with that redistribution came a terrifying asymmetry. Some powers could absorb loss and continue expanding. Others, devastated by plague, conquest, and resource seizure combined, were forced into submission or fragmentation. Human rule over the earth became increasingly uneven, concentrated through empires that were not merely stronger, but better positioned inside emerging networks of capital, metallurgy, navigation, and bureaucratic habit. The balance of worlds tilted. What vanished in this process was not only autonomy, but also plurality of memory. Local cosmologies, ecological understandings, political forms, and sacred geographies were pushed aside, translated poorly, or dismissed as superstition by systems convinced of their own universality. A people conquered militarily can survive. A people whose language, ritual calendar, land relation, and historical memory are rewritten faces a subtler danger. The body remains, but the world that body once inhabited begins to thin. Human dominion over the earth thus deepened through epistemic conquest as much as territorial conquest. The winning map was not only drawn across land, it was drawn across meaning. This is why the age of expansion should not be imagined simply as energetic motion outward. It was also inward, into archives, classrooms, courts, churches, censuses, tax rolls, botanical gardens, museums, and the growing apparatus that made imperial knowledge look neutral. Artifacts were removed from one narrative and placed into another. Landscapes were surveyed to improve administration. Forests were measured to optimize use. Peoples were categorized to justify hierarchy. Even time was reorganized, as local rhythms yielded to imperial and commercial ones. The world was not merely explored, it was reformatted. And yet, once again, the story resists pure simplification. Global contact also produced exchange, hybrid forms, unexpected solidarities, new intellectual awakenings, and resistance traditions of astonishing creativity. Ideas travelled with conquest, but did not remain obedient to conquerors. Colonized peoples adapted, survived, translated, rebelled, and reimagined. The planet was being compressed into one larger field of contact, and that contact was never one-directional for long. Still, imbalance remained the dominant fact. The expanding map had centres and margins, and the centres claimed the right to define reality. Perhaps that is the true threshold crossed here. The species no longer rules through local systems alone. It begins organising the planet as a single, though violently unequal arena. Oceans no longer separate worlds securely. Markets connect famine in one region to profit in another. Extraction in one colony feeds comfort in a distant capital. A line drawn in an office can reorder lives thousands of miles away. Power becomes abstract, distant, and yet intensely material in its effects. The Earth is being pulled into one human web, but not one shared fairly. That web will matter even more in what follows, because the momentum of global expansion does not stop with ships and colonies. It prepares the ground for something even more transformative: the release of buried geological energy at industrial scale, the mechanization of time, the acceleration of production, and the strange new phase in which humanity's domination of nature begins to resemble a war against the conditions that made civilization possible. If the map had already swallowed the planet, what would happen when the machine learned to feed on the planet itself? Once the planet had been drawn into expanding networks of empire, trade, classification, and extraction, another threshold opened beneath human feet, one buried for ages so immense that no early civilization could have imagined them. Forests had long been cut, rivers redirected, metals mined, and labour organised. Yet all of that would soon be overshadowed by a far stranger act: the large-scale release of ancient energy stored deep in coal seams, oil deposits and gas fields, remnants of worlds so old they belonged almost to another Earth. Humanity did not merely continue shaping the surface of the planet. It began burning the compressed memory of geological time. And from that fire came machines, acceleration, and a new phase of dominion so extreme that it started to resemble estrangement. There is something almost mythic in the industrial turn, though it arrived through furnaces, patents, workshops, engines, and mines rather than prophecy. Earlier ages had depended on muscle, wind, yet water, wood, and the disciplined coordination of human and animal bodies. Industrial systems altered the ratio between effort and effect on a scale that previous empires could scarcely have understood. A machine fed by fossil fuel could perform labour far beyond the endurance of flesh. A factory could multiply output with relentless consistency. A locomotive could bend distance. A steamship could ignore old rhythms of wind and season. The ruler of the earth was no longer simply the creature who organised labour and mapped the world. He was becoming the creature who could command buried time and force it into the present as power. This altered more than productivity. It altered tempo. One of the oldest quiet authorities over human life had been the pace imposed by seasons, roads, animal strength, daylight, and local resource limits. Industrialization broke that tempo apart. Time itself grew harder, more measurable, more extractable. Clocks had existed long before, but mechanized industry made time an instrument of discipline with unprecedented reach. Work could be synchronized, segmented, prolonged, and optimized. The factory whistle became a kind of secular bell, calling bodies not to prayer, but to production. Human beings who once organized themselves around weather, ritual, and agricultural cycles increasingly found themselves bound to schedules determined by machines. There is a bleak elegance in this transformation. Fire, which had once gathered small groups against the dark, now fed furnaces vast enough to blacken entire cities with soot. Metal, which had once sharpened tools and armed soldiers, now became the skeleton of rails, bridges, engines, and industrial infrastructure spreading across continents. Writing, which had begun by tracking grain and tribute, expanded into ledgers, contracts, technical manuals, bureaucratic systems, newspapers, and industrial administration. Every earlier human power was retained, but enlarged and accelerated until it no longer felt intimate. The species had scaled up its old capacities until they became planetary pressures, and with scaling came invisibility. A hunter sees the animal he kills. A farmer sees the field he tills. Even an ancient king, for all his abstraction, usually remains tied in some visible way to the land, the city, the flood, the harvest, the wall. Industrial power is different. The coal miner works in darkness, far from the drawing room lit by coal. The plantation grows cotton continents away from the mill. The factory worker feeds the machine but does not own the world the machine transforms. Cause and consequence stretch apart. Consumption becomes easier to separate from suffering. The system grows more powerful as it grows less emotionally legible. This may be one of the deepest costs of industrial dominion. Human beings became capable of altering the earth at a scale previously unimaginable, yet often without direct sensory contact with the full chain of damage. Smoke disperses, waste flows downstream, forests fall elsewhere, mines deepen beyond the horizon, oceans absorb. Atmospheres change gradually, almost politely at first. The machine asks only for input and provides output. It does not pause to ask what is missing from the world that made it possible. And still, one must acknowledge the genuine magnitude of what industrial civilization made possible. It expanded medicine, transport, communication, sanitation, literacy, engineering, and material abundance for large populations in ways no previous era had achieved. It reduced some forms of toil even as it invented new ones. It connected distant worlds with unprecedented speed. It generated scientific insight of extraordinary precision. It allowed humanity to study the planet, the atom, the genome, the deep past, and the farthest visible galaxies. To speak only of ruin would be dishonest. The industrial age enlarged human capability in ways that touched nearly every domain of life. Yet enlargement is not the same as wisdom. The same fossil-fueled systems that powered hospitals and public transport also powered imperial extraction, mechanized warfare, mass pollution, and the enormous expansion of consumption beyond any stable ecological relation. The machine, once built, demanded feeding. Cities swelled, railways cut through landscapes, factories consumed raw materials at accelerating rates. Oil, once tapped, made motion itself more abundant and more addictive. Internal combustion transformed not only travel, but the shape of settlement, the geography of commerce, and the atmosphere above every nation. The species began living as though buried sunlight were an inheritance without end. That illusion may be the most dangerous mythology modern humanity ever embraced. Earlier civilizations had often imagined themselves cosmologically central. Industrial civilization imagined itself energetically exempt. Limits still existed, but they could be deferred, outsourced, concealed, or overcome for another generation through more extraction, more innovation, more expansion. The earth became less a living field of reciprocity and more a reservoir of inputs awaiting conversion into economic motion. Forests became bored feet, rivers became hydroelectric potential, mountains became ore deposits, species became resources or obstacles, and even the atmosphere became a sink so vast that its patience was mistaken for infinity. This is where the word Anthropocene begins to cast its shadow, whether one accepts the term formally or not. Humanity, or more precisely certain industrial systems created by human societies, has become a geological force. Carbon once locked away over immense spans is released in centuries, then decades. Oceans warm and acidify, glaciers retreat, species vanish at rates that evoke older mass extinctions. Soil is exhausted, groundwater depleted, coral reefs whitened, forests fragmented. The ruler of the earth has grown so effective that he now destabilizes the conditions under which his own civilization developed. Dominion turns inward and becomes self-threatening. There is an eerie continuity here with earlier chapters of the story. The species that helped empty landscapes of megafauna now engineers extinctions at broader scale. The species that once used fire to create a local zone of warmth now alters the chemistry of the global atmosphere. The species that learned to organize labor now organizes entire planetary supply chains, whose cumulative effects no single participant fully experiences. The old pattern has not disappeared. It has intensified. Human power continues to transform the world, but the transformation is now too vast to feel fully human in emotional scale. It becomes abstract, even while its consequences remain painfully physical. Perhaps that is why modern life often carries a strange numbness beneath its brilliance. Human beings have never known so much about the workings of the earth, yet many live more distantly from the processes that sustain them than any ancestors did. Food arrives packaged, energy arrives through hidden systems, water through pipes, information through screens, seasons dulled by controlled interiors. The planet is studied with exquisite detail, while simultaneously becoming harder to feel directly. The ruler of the earth increasingly resembles a creature cut off from the earth by the very systems of mastery he has built. And still, the machine does not sleep. It asks for growth, throughput, efficiency, convenience, expansion. It reorganizes not only labor and matter, but desire itself. Comfort becomes expectation. Speed becomes virtue. Delay becomes failure. Repair yields to replacement. The market trains appetite to outrun reflection. Under such conditions, domination ceases to look like conquest and begins to look like normal life. This may be industrial civilization's most elegant disguise. It turns extraordinary planetary pressure into everyday routine. Yet routines built on hidden extraction remain vulnerable to revelation. Floods intensify, heat records fall, fires spread, species disappear, storms grow more erratic. The system that once promised liberation from nature now reveals how deeply it still depends on natural stability. The old dream of control becomes brittle under ecological feedback. Humanity has not escaped the earth. It has only widened the scale at which its actions return. So the long ascent approaches its most unsettling edge. Man has crossed continents, reorganized ecologies, built states, sanctified power, drawn the world into one map, and learned to burn the buried past of the planet to sustain an ever faster present. He stands closer than ever to complete earthly reach, yet that very reach has begun to undermine the ground beneath him, and perhaps that is the final irony before the end. The creature who sought to rule the earth may be discovering too late that rulership is easiest to imagine at the very moment belonging has nearly been lost. If so, then one question remains, waiting like a dim light at the far end of the machine's long corridor. After all this mastery, after all this naming, building, counting, sanctifying, extracting, and accelerating, has man truly become the ruler of the earth, or only the most temporary disturbance upon it? After all the crossings, the extinctions, the hearths, the burials, the fields, the walls, the tablets, the crowns, the ships, the engines, and the maps, drawn so tightly around the globe that almost nothing seemed left outside them, the question remains strangely untouched. It waits beneath every age like a stone not fully turned over. How did man become the ruler of the earth? The longer one follows the trail, the less that word, ruler, feels secure. It promises clarity, but the record offers turbulence. It suggests authority, but history reveals adaptation, accident, violence, imagination, and repeated encounters with forces larger than any design. If man did become ruler, it was not in the manner of a sovereign calmly ascending a throne prepared for him. It was something more uneven, more haunted, and perhaps less permanent than the stories later told about it. At the beginning of this long journey stood not a master but a vulnerable animal among many others, moving through a world dense with danger and already old beyond comprehension. Nothing announced its destiny. Bones broke, species vanished, climates shifted. The archive thinned and thickened by chance. What survived was never the whole truth, only enough fragments for later minds to imagine coherence. Out of that fractured beginning emerged a creature that learned to endure instability, to pass knowledge across generations, to keep fire alive, to bind itself through invisible meanings, and to move when familiar worlds became unlivable. Perhaps that was the first illusion hidden inside later triumph, the belief that rulership began with strength, when it may have begun with exposure. Exposure taught invention. Invention deepened into coordination. Coordination widened into systems, and systems, once dense enough, began to outlast individuals and reshape the earth itself. That may be the nearest one can come to an answer without simplifying the matter beyond recognition. Man became ruler of the earth not in one moment, not by one trait, not by one miracle, but by layering powers upon powers until vulnerability itself became difficult to see beneath them. Fire hid cold, language hid isolation, ritual hid mortality, agriculture hid dependence by renaming it order, writing hid forgetting by calling itself memory, states hid coercion inside law, cosmologies hid ambition inside sacred design. Industry hid planetary extraction inside convenience. Again and again, human beings learned to wrap fragility in structure until the wrapping began to look like nature itself. But structures have their own shadows. Every gain left an absence. Rival human species disappeared and left no testimony. Giants withdrew from plains and forests. Older cosmologies were buried under official ones. Local worlds dissolved into imperial maps. Rivers were harnessed and poisoned. Forests turned to fuel and commodity. Communities were reorganized into systems too large for any single person to understand. Even memory, once carried in bodies and stories, became institutional, curated, standardized, and sometimes stripped of what did not serve prevailing order. The ruler of the earth, if that is what humanity became, rose through a long sequence of exclusions as much as through creation. The earth was not only mastered, it was edited. This is why the story resists any simple moral frame. Human ascent cannot honestly be told as pure progress. Too much has been broken, yet it cannot be told as mere catastrophe either, because the same species that extracted and conquered also composed music from grief, tracked the movement of stars, painted caves in darkness, cared for the dead, preserved memory across collapses, and asked questions so deep they still unsettle the present. Humanity is too contradictory to fit comfortably into praise or condemnation. It survives by making meaning, and it often makes meaning from wounds it has partly inflicted itself. Perhaps that contradiction is the true centre of the matter. Man became ruler of the earth because he was never only one thing. He was at once frightened and ambitious, cooperative and violent, reverent and extractive, imaginative and destructive, capable of tenderness in one place and systems of immense cruelty in another. Other creatures altered their environments, but humanity learned to alter not only environments, but the terms under which environments were understood. It ruled through symbols as much as through tools. It ruled through stories as much as through armies. It ruled through expectations, calendars, doctrines, and categories, through the invisible architecture by which reality itself was sorted into what mattered and what could be spent. And still, something in that word ruler continues to tremble. Because a ruler, if the title means anything, is presumed to possess control. Yet control has never been complete. Ice ages came and went without permission. Disease crossed borders drawn by kings and empires. Droughts ignored prayer. Floods rose through cities that imagined themselves permanent. Markets collapsed. States dissolved. Machines overheated the very systems that sustained them. The atmosphere, treated for a time as a passive recipient of industrial excess, has begun answering in the old language of fire, storm, flood, heat, and loss. The earth has never entirely accepted the human version of its administration. That may be the most unsettling revelation hidden inside the whole story. Humanity's greatest powers have always emerged from dependence on forces it did not create. Climate patterns, photosynthesis, deep geological storage, hydrological cycles, fertile soil, stable coastlines, the long patience of ecosystems, the molecular inheritance of life itself, even technology, for all its brilliance, rearranges what already exists. The species names, extracts, accelerates, and engineers. But it does not originate the ground of being from which its powers arise. In that sense, human rulership has always been conditional, more like tenancy mistaken for ownership. There is an old habit in civilizations, perhaps in consciousness itself, to confuse duration with permanence. A structure stands for centuries and begins to feel eternal. A system organizes millions of lives and begins to feel inevitable. A species spreads across every continent and begins to feel chosen. Yet geological time watches such confidence with indifference. Continents move, seas rise, magnetic fields shift, volcanoes erupt, ice returns, biodiversity thins and renews along lines no empire can legislate. From that perspective, the whole human project, magnificent, terrifying, intricate, and loud, may be little more than a bright interval, a long flare in the dark metabolism of the planet. And yet the interval matters. It matters because it is conscious of itself. The mammoth did not write elegies for the world it inhabited. The trilobite did not ask whether it belonged to the sea. Human beings do something stranger. They become both actors within history and witnesses to their own becoming. They sense loss before it is complete. They imagine futures they may never live to see. They uncover the bones of vanished relatives and feel something like guilt, or wonder, or kinship, or dread. The species that may be only a temporary disturbance upon the earth is also the species capable of recognizing temporariness. That awareness does not guarantee wisdom, but it introduces a possibility no earlier chapter possessed fully, the possibility of restraint born not from weakness, but from understanding. Whether that possibility will ripen is another question entirely. The same intelligence that reveals limits can also rationalize delay. The same imagination that feels awe can build more elegant systems of denial. Human history offers too many examples of warning arriving before change and still being ignored. To know is not to turn. To see is not to renounce. The ruler of the earth may be most endangered not by ignorance, but by the habit of believing that insight alone counts as transformation. So the story comes to rest where it began, not in certainty, but in a dimmer and perhaps more honest light. A fragile creature rose through memory, cooperation, violence, invention, ritual, agriculture, empire, industry, and myth, until it could redraw almost every corner of the known world. It became powerful enough to rename the planets ages after itself. But power is not the same as belonging, and scale is not the same as permanence. The earth beneath the roads, beneath the harvests, beneath the archives and satellites and power grids, is older than every crown and every theory of rightful dominion. It receives all rulers eventually with the same silence that covered the bones of those who once imagined their order would endure. And maybe that is the final image worth keeping as the night deepens. Not a throne, not a flag, not a city of light seen from above, but a quieter scene. Wind moving over ruins no one claims completely anymore. Roots passing through stone. Dust settling on names once spoken with absolute confidence. Somewhere below, older layers remain. Ash, bone, pollen, shell, forgotten hearths, extinct footprints, drowned roads, and the long, patient memory of a planet that does not hurry to explain itself. Man may have become the ruler of the earth for a while, in the only sense history allows, but whether the earth ever accepted that rule, or merely endured it until the next silence, is a question that remains open in the dark.